On Thanksgiving Day, my daughter looked me in the eye and screamed that the best gift I could give her would be for me to be gone forever, so that is exactly what I did. I pulled out my phone, paid off their entire mortgage right there at the dinner table, and booked a one-way ticket to Hawaii first class. But what I left on her desk the next morning was not a thank you note or a check. It was a single blue file folder containing secrets that would destroy her marriage, her finances, and her entire fake life. Before I tell you what was in that folder, let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by the very people you sacrificed everything for. The sound of the carving knife hitting the expensive porcelain platter was sharp enough to cut the tension in the room, but not sharp enough to cut through the disrespect coming from the head of the table. Brad, my white son-in-law with his teeth whitened to an unnatural blinding brightness, was carving the turkey. He sliced the meat aggressively, as if he were taking out his frustration on the dead bird. "Reggie, do you mind if I speak frankly?" Brad did not look at me. He spoke while dropping a piece of dry breast meat onto my plate. He never called me Dad or Mr. King. It was always Reggie, spoken with a tone that suggested I was his employee rather than his elder. I sat at the far end of the table, smoothing the napkin over my lap. "Speak your mind, Brad. Do not let anything spoil the meal. The electric bill is up again this month," Brad said, dropping the knife onto the table with a loud clatter. He took a sip of red wine, the kind I knew he bought with a credit card that was already over its limit. "That guest house out back is sucking up power like a black hole. Are you running the heater 24/7 out there? We are not a bank, Reggie. Natural gas prices are skyrocketing, and frankly, we cannot afford to subsidize your comfort." I looked at him, then I looked at Keisha, my daughter. She was staring down into her bowl of pumpkin soup, avoiding my eyes. She was wearing a silk dress that cost too much and fake diamond earrings, trying so hard to look like she belonged to the upper-class world her husband was pretending to live in. "Brad," I said, my voice deep and slow, the voice of a man who had once commanded a combat engineering platoon under fire overseas. "I only turn the heat on when the temperature drops below 60 degrees. And if memory serves, I gave Keisha $500 in cash last month to contribute to the household expenses. That money is more than enough to cover the electric bill for this entire property, not just the renovated shed you call a guest house." Brad's face turned a deep shade of red. He hated being reminded about money, especially when he was broke. He turned to Keisha, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You took money from him. What did I tell you? We do not need his handouts. We need him to stop draining our resources. I used it to buy the groceries for this dinner," Keisha stammered, her hand trembling as she reached for her water glass. "Brad, please do not make a scene. It is Thanksgiving." "To hell with Thanksgiving." Brad slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "I am out here carrying the weight of this startup company, trying to build a future, and your father is living like a king in the backyard with zero responsibilities. He probably keeps that place warmer than our master bedroom. Do you know what the guys at the club say? They call me a saint for housing my wife's elderly black father who contributes nothing." The room went silent. The word freeloading hung in the air. The way he emphasized elderly was like a knife aimed straight at my heart. But I did not blink. I have faced enemies far more dangerous than Brad. He was just a boy with an ego larger than his bank account. "Freeloading," I repeated calmly, slicing a piece of turkey. "Brad, this house." "Do not start with the history lesson," Brad interrupted, his voice rising to a shout. "This house is in my name and Keisha's name. The deed is clear. You are just a guest here, Reggie, and guests need to know their place. If you do not like the rules, the county nursing home on the south side still has beds available. It is $800 a month, state subsidized. That is probably more your speed than this neighborhood anyway." I put my fork down. I looked at Keisha. She was still silent. Her silence hurt more than 1,000 insults from Brad. She was the daughter I had held in my arms when my wife Viola passed away. I had worked 16 hours a day from dusty construction sites to sleepless nights drawing engineering blueprints just so she would never know what it meant to want for anything. I had bought this land with cash back in 1998 when it was nothing but mud and weeds, and I built the foundation of her future with my own hands. And now she was letting her husband threaten to throw me into a charity ward. "Keisha," I said softly, calling her name. "What do you think? Do you want me in a budget nursing home too?" Keisha looked up. Her eyes were red, but not from love for me. It was from pressure, from pride, from fear of her husband, and most importantly, from an ingratitude that had rotted her to the core. "Just stop it, Dad!" Keisha screamed, tears finally spilling over, ruining her expensive makeup. "Why do you always have to make things difficult for Brad? He is under so much pressure. He wants what is best for this family. And you just sit there silent, walking around like a ghost. You scare my friends when they come over. You embarrass me walking around the yard in those old work coveralls." She stood up, throwing her napkin onto the oak floor, the very floor I had laid plank by plank 20 years ago. "You want to know what I think?" Keisha yelled, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I think Brad is right. We need space. We need privacy. I am tired of taking care of your feelings. The greatest gift, the best Thanksgiving gift you could ever give me, is the day you are gone. Go anywhere. Just get out of my life and stop haunting me." The sentence hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Brad smirked, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms, with the triumphant look of a predator who just saw the trap snap shut. He knew he had won. He had isolated me, turning my own daughter into a weapon against me. I looked at Keisha. In her eyes, I no longer saw the little girl who used to beg me for ice cream. I only saw a stranger selfish and cruel. My old heart gave a painful thump, and then it went cold. It froze over. 40 years of sacrifice had just been incinerated in a single sentence. I did not scream back. I did not cry. I did not slam the table. I did what an old soldier always does when he realizes the position is lost. I retreated to save my strength for the final counterattack. I slowly stood up. I adjusted the collar of my frayed shirt. I looked straight into Brad's eyes, then turned to Keisha. "Very well," I said. My voice was so calm it made Brad flinch slightly. "Your wish is granted. Enjoy your meal." I turned my back and walked out of the lavish dining room, walking through the hallway lined with meaningless abstract art Brad had bought to replace the old family photos. I stepped out the back door and the cold wind slapped my face. Snow was beginning to fall. I walked toward the small guest house at the end of the garden. Brad thought I was going out there to cry and pack a few rags. He thought that tomorrow he would put me on a bus and take over the guest house to turn it into his personal gym. He did not know that I was not going there to sleep. I was going there to open the trap door hidden under the floorboards. Down there were not old clothes. Down there was an industrial-grade fireproof safe. Inside were the original deeds to this land, the bank statements showing millions of dollars in assets I had accumulated from construction patents, and most importantly, the surveillance system monitoring the entire main house that Brad knew nothing about. Tonight I would not sleep. Tonight I would watch what they did when they thought the old man was defeated, and tomorrow would be the most memorable Thanksgiving of their lives. I put my key into the lock of the guest house. It clicked loudly in the cold night air. The chess game had begun. The heavy deadbolt slid home with a satisfying clunk, sealing me inside the only place on earth where I was truly myself. The guest house was cold, but it smelled of machine oil and old paper smells that comforted me more than the lavender air freshener Keisha sprayed everywhere in the main house to mask the scent of her own unhappiness. I did not turn on the lights. I did not need them. I knew every inch of this 400-square-foot room in the pitch black. I stood still, listening. Outside, heavy footsteps crunched through the fresh snow. They stopped right in front of my door. The handle rattled violently. Then a fist pounded against the wood. "Open up, Reggie." It was Brad. His voice was slurred, thick with the expensive wine he had been guzzling. "Open this door. We need to talk about the schedule for tomorrow. The moving van is coming at 8 a.m. sharp, and I do not want you dragging your feet." I stood 3 inches from the door on the other side, silent as a stone. I controlled my breathing just as I had been trained to do in the jungles of Vietnam 50 years ago when a single sound meant death. Brad pounded again, harder this time. "Open up, you senile old bat. I know you are in there." He waited. I waited. The wind howled around the corners of the small structure. Finally, I heard him scoff. "Fine. Sulk in the dark. Tomorrow you are the state's problem." I heard him fumble with his phone. The glow of his screen cast a blue light under the door crack. He was making a call. "Yeah, it is me," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, the timeline has moved up. We need those papers Monday morning. Yeah, the competency hearing. Dr. Miller is on board. He signed the affidavit stating the old man has advanced dementia and is a danger to himself. Just get the judge to rubber stamp the emergency guardianship. I want access to his accounts by noon on Monday." My hands clenched into fists in the dark. Monday. That gave me less than 48 days. They were not just kicking me out. They were executing a legal coup to strip me of my autonomy. They wanted to erase Reginald King the man and replace him with Reginald King the ward of the state. Brad laughed, a short, cruel sound. Yeah, the house is practically sold. The land value alone covers my spread with the bookies in Vegas plus interest. All right, see you Monday. The footsteps crunched away, fading back toward the warmth of the main house. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. My heart was hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. They were selling the land to pay off gambling debts. That was the missing piece. Brad wasn't just a failed entrepreneur. He was a gambler, and he had bet my life on his losing streak. I moved to the center of the room. I knelt down and rolled back the cheap synthetic rug. Beneath it, the floorboards looked ordinary, scratched and worn oak, but I knew the secret. I took a small, powerful magnet from my pocket and placed it over a specific knot in the wood. There was a soft, metallic click. A hidden latch released. I lifted the section of flooring. It was heavy, reinforced with a steel plate on the underside. Below lay my sanctuary, a concrete-lined cavity 2 feet deep containing a fireproof safe the size of a large suitcase. This was the bunker. I entered the combination by touch. The lock tumbled. I opened the lid, and the faint glow of the LED battery indicator illuminated the contents. It was not piles of cash or gold bars, although there was enough emergency currency to get me to any country in the world. It was paper. My fingers brushed the leather binder. I pulled it out and set it on the desk, turning on a small tactical lamp. The light hit the top document. United States Patent Number 49226, high-tensile reinforced concrete composition for subterranean structures. Inventor Reginald King, dated 1982. Brad called me a freeloading bricklayer. He had no idea that the freeway overpass he drove his leased BMW on every day stood on pillars made from my formula. He did not know that the royalties from that single patent had quietly accumulated in a blind trust for 30 years, turning into a fortune that dwarfed his entire existence. To him, I was just a pair of dirty coveralls. To the construction industry, I was a ghost legend. I pushed the patent aside. Nostalgia was a luxury I could not afford tonight. I reached back into the safe and pulled out a black laptop and a tangle of cables. I set them up on the desk, connecting the laptop to a dedicated encrypted server I kept running in the basement of the main house disguised as an old fuse box. I typed in the password. The screen flickered to life, dividing into a grid of 6 camera feeds. When I bought this property, I supervised every inch of the renovation. I told Keisha I was upgrading the electrical wiring. What I was actually doing was installing pinhole cameras and high-gain microphones in every common room and the master suite. At the time, I told myself it was for their security. I wanted to protect my daughter. Deep down, I think I always knew I would need to protect myself from them. I maximized the feed from the living room. The image was crisp in high definition. Brad and Keisha were sitting on the white leather sofa I had paid for. They were clinking glasses. To freedom, Brad said, taking a long swallow of champagne. To getting our lives back. Keisha looked hesitant. She was twirling her wedding ring, the one I knew Brad had bought with money he stole from her savings account. "Brad, are you sure about Dr. Miller?" she asked. "It feels wrong lying to a judge." "Dad is difficult, but he is not crazy." Brad put his arm around her, but his eyes were cold, staring at the television. "It is not lying, babe. It is necessary. Look at him. He is hoarding resources he does not use. He sits on that pile of cash, his pension, whatever little he has, while we drown. It is selfish. We are doing him a favor. The state will take better care of him than we can. And once the guardianship goes through, we can liquidate his assets to cover the business loans." He was lying to her even now. Business loans. He meant his gambling debts. Keisha sighed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I just hope he does not make a scene tomorrow when the movers come." "He will not," Brad said confidently. "I broke him tonight. Did you see his face at dinner? The fight is gone. He is just a tired old dog ready to be put down." I stared at the screen. A tired old dog. Is that what they saw? I switched the audio feed to the master bedroom. I wanted to check the camera angle in Brad's home office. I cycled through the views until I found it. The office was dark, but the infrared camera showed everything clearly. The desk was messy, covered in overdue notices. But what caught my eye was the laptop sitting on the desk. It was open. I typed a command into my keyboard. I had administrative access to their entire network. I mirrored Brad's laptop screen onto my monitor. He had left his email open. I scrolled through his inbox. Debt collection, final notice, and then a folder labeled Project Freedom. I opened it. My blood ran cold. It was not just the guardianship papers. It was a brochure for a facility called Shady Pines. I knew that place. It was a state-run warehouse for the indigent elderly. It had been cited 12 times for health violations in the last year alone. Bed sores, malnutrition, neglect. That was where he intended to put me. He wasn't sending me to a home. He was sending me to a graveyard so he could cash out my life for poker chips. I closed the folder. I had seen enough. My hands were steady as I reached into the safe for the last item, a red external hard drive. This drive contained the nuclear option, the financial forensics. For 5 years, I had been secretly acting as an angel investor for Brad's startup using a shell company. I wanted him to succeed for Keisha's sake. I had poured $200,000 into his tech venture, and for 5 years I had watched him siphon that money off to pay for leases, dinners, and trips to Vegas while cooking the books to show business expenses. I had the bank transfers. I had the fake invoices. I had the proof of embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion. I could send him to prison for 10 years with the click of a mouse. But prison was too easy. Prison gave him 3 meals a day and a roof over his head. I wanted him to feel the cold wind I felt tonight. I wanted him to stand in the ruins of his arrogance and know that he was the architect of his own destruction. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Tomorrow was Friday, Black Friday. The banks would be open. The courts would be open. Brad thought he had until Monday to bury me. He was wrong. The clock was not ticking for me. It was ticking for him. I picked up the phone, the burner phone I kept in the safe, and dialed a number I had not called in 20 years. It rang twice. King Residence, a gruff voice answered. Judge Vance, I said, my voice firm. It is Reggie. I am cashing in that favor. I need you to prepare a writ of eviction, and I need it ready by noon tomorrow. There was a pause on the other line, then a low chuckle. I thought you were retired, Reggie. I said, looking at the image of Brad on the screen, laughing at his own cleverness. But someone just declared war on my soil, and I do not leave enemy combatants standing. I hung up. I looked at the patent document one last time. High tensile strength. That is what I was made of. That is what they were about to find out. I closed the laptop. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark chair facing the door, waiting for the sun to rise. The time for mercy was over. The time for correction had begun. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when I slipped out the back door of the guest house. The air was biting cold, a sharp reminder that winter in Chicago did not negotiate. Inside the main house, the windows were dark. Brad and Keisha were likely sleeping off their wine and their victory, dreaming of the renovations they would make once the old man was gone. They did not know that the old man was currently walking across the frozen lawn to his rusted Ford pickup truck, parked a block away, to avoid waking them. It was Black Friday. The rest of the country was lining up at electronics stores to fight over cheap televisions. I was going to war. My destination was not a mall, but a fortress of solitude in the affluent suburb of Oak Park, the home of the Honorable Judge Samuel Vance, retired. Sam was the only man alive who knew the full extent of my assets. We had served together in the engineering corps building bridges under fire. We learned early on that a structure is only as strong as its foundation, and that sometimes to save the bridge, you have to blow it up. I knocked on his heavy mahogany door at 6 a.m. He opened it immediately, wearing a silk robe and holding a steaming mug of black coffee. He did not look surprised. He looked ready. "Come in, Reggie," he said, his voice gravelly from decades of cigars and courtroom arguments. "The coffee is hot. The printer is warmed up." We went straight to his study, a room that smelled of leather and old law books. I sat down and placed the leather binder from my safe on his desk. I opened it to the deed section. Sam adjusted his reading glasses and pulled out the document we had drafted together 25 years ago, the ground lease agreement. "You know what this does?" Reggie Sam said, looking over the rims of his glasses. "This is the nuclear option. You are pulling the earth out from under them, literally." I nodded, taking the coffee he offered. "They are trying to declare me incompetent, Sam. They want to put me in a state facility and liquidate everything. Brad has gambling debts. He is desperate." Sam's eyes hardened. He knew about debts. He had sentenced enough men because of them. He picked up a fountain pen. "All right, let's review the trap." He spread the documents out. The legal structure was a masterpiece of asset protection. The house, the physical structure of brick and mortar, stood in Keisha and Brad's names. I had allowed that when they got married to help them build credit. But the land, the actual plot of earth the house sat on, belonged to the King Family Trust. And I was the trust. They had signed a 99-year ground lease. It was standard procedure in commercial real estate, but rare for residential. They had signed it without reading it, probably thinking it was just another formality from the eccentric old father-in-law. But there was a clause. Clause 14B. Sam tapped the paragraph with his pen. Here it is. The termination on encumbrance satisfaction. If the primary mortgage on the improvements, meaning the house, is satisfied in full, the lessor, meaning you, reserves the right to renegotiate the lease terms or terminate the lease entirely with 30 days' notice. It was a safety switch I had built in years ago. I wanted to ensure that if they ever paid off the house, or if I paid it off for them, I could reassess their stability before granting them full ownership of the land. It was designed to protect them from predators. Now I was using it to protect myself from them. So the plan is simple, Sam said, leaning back. You pay off their mortgage, you free them from the bank, and in doing so, you trigger your right to evict them from your land. Exactly, I said. They will think it is a parting gift, a senile old man trying to buy their love one last time. They will take the bait because they are greedy, and once the bank sends that letter of satisfaction, the clock starts ticking. Sam began typing furiously on his computer, drafting the notice of lease termination. The clacking of the keys sounded like gunfire in the quiet room. Reggie, Sam said without stopping his typing, you know this destroys them, right? They own a house they cannot move. If you terminate the lease, they have to vacate. They lose the asset. You are bankrupting your own daughter. She bankrupted herself when she decided to throw me away, I said, my voice flat. She chose a gambler over her father. She chose appearances over loyalty. I am not destroying her, Sam. I am giving her a hard reset. If she survives this, she will be stronger. If she does not, then she was never strong enough to inherit my legacy anyway. Sam stopped typing. He looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and respect. He printed the document. It slid out of the machine crisp and white. He stamped it with his notary seal. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper echoed in the room. It is done, he said, handing me the document. You have the eviction notice. Now you just need to spring the trap. I took the paper and folded it carefully, placing it inside my jacket pocket next to my heart. Thank you, Sam. He walked me to the door. Be careful, Reggie. Desperate men do dangerous things. Brad is cornered. When he realizes what you have done, he might get violent. I touched the scar on my forearm, a souvenir from a conflict far bloodier than this one. Let him try, I said. I drove from Sam's house to the First National Bank downtown. It was opening time. The lobby was quiet. The Black Friday crowds were at the malls, not the banks. I walked up to the teller window. The young woman behind the glass looked at my worn coat and my tired eyes. Can I help you, sir? She asked, her tone polite but dismissive. She probably thought I was there to cash a Social Security check. I need to make a withdrawal, I said, sliding my debit card and ID under the glass. She typed in my account number. Her eyes went wide. She typed it again. Then she looked up at me, her entire demeanor changing. One moment, Mr. King. Let me get the branch manager. Minutes later, I was sitting in a plush office sipping sparkling water. The manager was sweating slightly. Mr. King, we do not usually keep this amount of cash on hand for withdrawal. We can issue a cashier's check. That will be fine, I said. Make it out to the mortgage servicer for $450,000. And I need $5,000 in cash for travel expenses. The manager typed the numbers. $450,000. It was a fortune to most people. To me, it was the price of a lesson. I watched him print the check. It looked so small, a simple slip of paper, that was about to bring down a house of cards. I took the check and the envelope of cash. I walked out of the bank into the bright, cold morning. The wind cut through my coat, but I did not feel it. I felt light. I sat in my truck and looked at the check. This was the bait. Brad would see this money and he would see salvation. He would see his gambling debts disappearing. He would see a fresh start. He would be so blinded by the money he would not ask why I was giving it to him. He would assume I was weak. He would assume I was trying to buy my way back into the house, or perhaps that I was just a foolish old man trying to do one last good deed before dying. He would never suspect that this check was the key that locked the door behind him. I started the engine. I had to get back before they woke up. I had to play the role of the defeated father one last time. I had to look broken. I had to look scared. As I drove back toward the house that was no longer my home, I rehearsed my lines. I would apologize. I would beg for forgiveness. I would hand them the check with shaking hands. I would watch their eyes light up with greed. And then I would leave. I would fly to Hawaii, and I would wait for the mail to arrive. I pulled into the alley behind the house, parking the truck out of sight. I crept back into the guest house, my heart beating a steady rhythm. I checked the cameras. They were still asleep. I sat down at the small desk and pulled out the eviction notice Sam had prepared. I read the legal language one more time. Pursuant to Clause 14B, lease terminated. 30 days to vacate. Failure to comply will result in forced removal. I placed the eviction notice inside the blue file folder. I placed the photos of Brad and his mistress on top of it. I placed the bank statements showing his embezzlement next to them. The trap was set. The bait was ready. Now all I had to do was feed the sharks. I stood up and walked to the mirror. I looked at my reflection. The gray hair, the lines on my face, the eyes that had seen too much. "Showtime, Reggie," I whispered. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the snow, walking toward the main house with the check in my pocket, burning like a live coal. I stood outside the back door of the main house, my hand resting on the cold metal knob. My heart was not racing. It was beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a demolition expert watching the timer tick down to 0. In my pocket, the cashier's check for $450,000 felt heavier than a brick. It was the most expensive lie I had ever told, but it was also the most necessary. I took a deep breath, let my shoulders slump forward, and deliberately clouded my eyes with a look of confusion and fear. I had to sell this. I had to be the broken old man they wanted me to be. I turned the knob and stepped into the warmth of the kitchen. The smell of bacon and coffee hit me instantly, a sharp contrast to the cold air I had just left. Brad and Keisha were sitting at the breakfast island. They looked up as I entered, their faces hardening instantly. "Well, look who decided to join the living," Brad sneered, putting down his mug of coffee. "I thought you were packing, Reggie. The movers will be here in 2 hours. Do not tell me you are going to make this difficult." Keisha refused to look at me. She was staring at her phone, scrolling through social media, probably looking for validation from strangers to drown out the guilt of evicting her own father. "Dad, please," she said, her voice tight. "Just get your things ready. We do not want a scene." I walked slowly toward them, shuffling my feet slightly, my head bowed. I did not look at Brad. I looked at the floor, at the expensive Italian tiles I had paid for 3 years ago when Keisha said the old linoleum was embarrassing. "I am packing," I said, my voice trembling just enough to be convincing. I wanted to give you something before I go." Brad scoffed. "Give us what?" "Your old collection of National Geographics." "We do not want your junk, Reggie. We want the space." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. My hand shook as I held it out. It was not an act. My hand shook with the effort of not crumbling the paper into a ball and shoving it down his throat. "I know I have been a burden," I said, letting a tear well up in my eye. "I know I am old and maybe I am losing my step a little. I do not want to be a problem for you kids. I just want you to be happy." Brad snatched the envelope from my hand with the grace of a starving dog. He ripped it open, not caring that he tore the paper. He pulled out the check. The silence that fell over the kitchen was absolute. Brad stared at the slip of paper. His eyes went wide, comically wide. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from the check to me, then back to the check. Keisha looked up finally. "What is it, Brad?" He handed her the check, his hand trembling now too. Keisha gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with sudden tears. $450,000, she whispered. "Dad, where did you get this?" "I saved it," I said, looking down at my worn boots. "It was my retirement, my life savings. I sold some old investments a long time ago. I was saving it for a rainy day, but I see now that the rainy day is here." I looked up, meeting Keisha's eyes. I saw the conflict in them, the guilt warring with the greed. But I also saw the greed winning. It always won. "I want to pay off the house for you," I continued, my voice soft. "I know you have been struggling with the payments. I know Brad's business has been slow. I do not want you to worry about the mortgage anymore. I want this house to be yours free and clear before I go away." Brad stood up so fast his stool screeched against the floor. He walked around the island and stood in front of me. He was breathing hard, his face flushed. He looked at the check again as if verifying it was real. You are paying off the mortgage, he asked, his voice high and tight. The whole thing? Yes, I said. It is everything I have. But family is more important than money, right? Brad looked at me. For a second I thought he might suspect something. I thought he might ask why a man being evicted would give his tormentors $500,000. But then a slow smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated greed. A predator's smile. Well, Reggie, he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder, a hand that felt heavy and false. This is unexpected, very generous. I mean, wow. This changes things. Does it? Keisha asked, hope rising in her voice. Dad, if you do this, maybe you do not have to go to the county home. Maybe we can find a better place. Or maybe, Brad cut her off with a sharp look. Babe, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Your dad is right. He needs specialized care. This money secures our future so we can make sure he gets the best care possible. Right, Reggie? He was lying. He had no intention of finding me a better place. He was going to take the money and still dump me in the state facility. He was going to have his cake and eat it too. I nodded meekly. Whatever you think is best, Brad. I just want to know you are safe. I just want to know the house is yours. Brad looked at the check again. His mind was already spending it. I could see the gears turning. He was thinking about his gambling debts. He was thinking about the bookies who had been threatening to break his legs. He was thinking about the Porsche he wanted to buy. I need to verify this, he said, suddenly, his suspicion flaring up for a moment. I mean, no offense, Reggie, but this is a lot of money. I need to make sure it is legit before I get excited. Of course, I said. Call the bank. It is a cashier's check. It is as good as cash. Brad pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the check. He put it on speaker. I stood there, head bowed, listening to the automated voice. Then the teller on the other end confirmed the funds. Yes, sir. Check number 4922, issued today in the amount of $450,000. The funds are secured. Brad hung up. He let out a whoop of joy. He grabbed Keisha and spun her around. We are rich, babe. We are debt-free. Oh my God. Keisha was laughing and crying at the same time. She came over and hugged me. It was a stiff, awkward hug, but for a moment she smelled like the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders. Thank you, Dad, she sobbed. Thank you so much. I am so sorry about everything. We will make sure you are taken care of. I promise. I patted her back gently. I know, baby, I know. Brad walked over, grinning like a shark. He stuck out his hand. Reggie, you are a good man. A little confused maybe, but a good man. You did the right thing. This saves us. I shook his hand. It was limp and sweaty. I am glad, Brad. Just promise me one thing. Promise me you will pay the mortgage today. I want to know it is done before I go. Brad laughed. Consider it done, old-timer. I am driving to the bank the second they open. This house is going to be ours free and clear by noon. Ours. He had no idea. I turned to leave. I better go finish packing, I said. The movers will be here soon. Take your time, Reggie. Brad called out, his voice cheerful and magnanimous. Hell, take an extra hour. We are in no rush now. I walked out of the kitchen, my steps slow and shuffling until I was out of their sight. I walked down the hallway, past the abstract art, past the expensive furniture, past the life I had built and they had stolen. As I reached the back door, I heard Brad's voice from the kitchen. He must have thought I was out of earshot. Can you believe it? He said, his voice dripping with contempt and glee. The old fool actually did it. He gave us everything. $500,000, Keisha. Do you know what this means? We can pay off the house and still have enough to invest. But Brad, Keisha said, her voice wavering. Shouldn't we let him stay now? I mean, he gave us everything. Brad laughed a cruel, hard sound. Are you kidding? He is still a burden, babe. Money does not change that. He is losing his mind. He needs to be in a facility. We will take the money, pay off the house, and he still goes to Shady Pines on Monday. It is a win-win. He feels like a hero, and we get our lives back. Stupid old man, he just paid for his own eviction. I stood there in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He had just confirmed everything. There was no redemption for him. No mercy. Stupid old man, I whispered to myself. I opened the back door and stepped out into the snow. The wind was picking up, swirling the flakes around me. I walked back to the guest house, my posture straightening with every step. The shuffle was gone. The tremor in my hands was gone. Brad thought he had won. He thought he had stripped me clean. He thought he was the king of the castle. He did not know that by cashing that check, by paying off that mortgage, he was pulling the pin on a grenade I had buried under the foundation 25 years ago. I entered the guest house and locked the door. I went straight to the desk. The blue file was waiting. I opened it and looked at the eviction notice. It was blank where the date should be. I picked up a pen. I wrote in today's date. Then I wrote the time. 12 p.m. At noon, the bank would process the payment. The mortgage would be satisfied, the encumbrance on the property would be lifted, and Clause 14B of the ground lease would activate. The land would be mine again, and anything standing on it, including the house, including Brad, including his ego, would be trespassing. I checked my watch. 9 a.m., 3 hours. I sat down in the chair and watched the monitors. Brad was already putting on his coat keys in hand, ready to run to the bank. He looked so happy, so victorious. "Go ahead, son," I said to the screen. "Run to the bank. Deposit that check. Sign your own death warrant." I leaned back and waited. The trap was sprung. Now all I had to do was watch it snap shut. The guest house was quiet, a stark contrast to the triumphant noise I could hear even from across the yard coming from the main house. Brad was blasting music, probably celebrating his windfall. I stood in the center of the room, my small leather duffel bag open on the bed. It was the same bag I had carried home from deployment 30 years ago. It had held my life then, and it would hold my life now. I did not pack the flannel shirts or the worn denim jeans I wore to work in the garden. I left the heavy winter coat hanging by the door. Those were costumes, the uniform of the harmless old man they thought I was. Instead, I reached into the back of the closet and pulled out a garment bag I had kept sealed for years. Inside was a tailored charcoal suit, pressed and pristine. I laid it gently on the bed. Next, I opened the small velvet box on the nightstand. My silver star medal gleamed under the lamplight. I ran my thumb over the ribbon, remembering the bridge in Kuwait, the mortar fire, the men I had pulled from the rubble. Brad thought I was weak because I walked with a limp. He did not know the limp was the only thing left of a shrapnel wound that should have killed me. I placed the medal in the side pocket of the duffel bag. Then I picked up the framed photo from the desk. Viola. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling. It was taken on our honeymoon in Jamaica, before we had money, before we had land, before we had a daughter who would betray us. I wrapped the photo in a silk scarf and placed it carefully in the bag. That was it. A suit of metal and a memory. Everything else, the furniture, the books, the tools I left behind, they were just things, and things could be replaced. Dignity could not. I zipped the bag shut. It was light. Paradoxically, the less I carried, the heavier the moment felt. I was leaving the home I had built, the ground I had tamed, but I was also leaving behind the weight of their ingratitude. I checked my watch. 10 a.m. Brad would be in his office now, making calls, spreading the news of his sudden fortune. He would be careless. Victory makes men sloppy. I slipped the burner phone into my pocket and picked up a small black USB drive from the desk. It looked like a standard flash drive, but it contained a piece of software I had written myself. A keylogger and remote access Trojan designed to bypass standard firewalls. It was a relic from my days in military intelligence, updated for modern operating systems. I walked out of the guest house and crossed the yard. The snow was melting, turning into gray slush. I entered the main house through the back door again. It was unlocked. It was always unlocked. The music was louder inside. Thumping bass coming from the living room speakers. I could hear Brad's voice booming from his office down the hall. "Baby, I am telling you, it is done," he was shouting into his phone. 450 large. Just handed it to me. Yeah. The old fool thinks he is buying my love. Can you believe it? I moved silently down the hallway, my footsteps masked by the music and his own arrogance. I stopped outside his office door, which was slightly ajar. I peeked inside. Brad was pacing back and forth, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his phone in the other. He was talking to Tiffany. "We are booking the penthouse," he said, laughing. "Yeah, the one with the ocean view. No, Keisha thinks I am paying off the business loan. She does not know about the other account." I waited. He turned his back to the door, looking out the window at the driveway, probably waiting for the movers. This was my chance. I slipped into the room. His laptop was open on the desk, the screen glowing. I plugged the USB drive into the side port. A small command window popped up on the screen. I typed a single line of code and hit enter. The upload bar raced across the screen. 90%, 95. Yeah, I will be there in an hour, Brad said, turning around. I just gotta wait for the check to clear. He stopped. He saw me standing there. Reggie, he barked, lowering the phone but not ending the call. What the hell are you doing sneaking around? I thought you were packing. I am, I said, my voice calm, my body blocking his view of the laptop screen. The upload hit 100%. The window vanished. I pulled the drive out and palmed it. I just came to say goodbye, Brad. And to give you this. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They were the keys to the guest house. You can have them now, I said, placing them on the corner of his desk. I am done with them. Brad looked at the keys, then at me. He sneered. Finally. About time you made yourself useful. Now get out. I am on an important call. I nodded slowly. I bet you are. Enjoy your celebration, Brad. I turned and walked out. As I left the room, I heard him say into the phone, Sorry, babe, just the help. Yeah, he is leaving now, finally getting rid of the dead weight. I walked back to the kitchen. Keisha was there packing dishes into a box. She looked up, her eyes red and puffy. Dad, she said, her voice small. Are you ready? I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the little girl who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. I saw the teenager who cried when she didn't get into her first choice college. And I saw the woman who stood by while her husband called me a dead weight. I am ready, Keisha, I said. She took a step toward me, then stopped. Where will you go? Do you have a place? I have a plan, I said. Do not worry about me. You have enough to worry about. She nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't making a scene. Okay. Well, call us when you get settled. We can come visit. I almost laughed. Visit. She thought she would be visiting me in a state-run facility smelling of bleach and despair. She had no idea. I will be in touch, I said. I picked up my duffel bag from where I had left it by the door. I did not hug her. I did not say I love you. Those words had lost their meaning in this house. I walked out the front door and down the steps. The Uber was waiting at the curb, a black sedan, sleek and anonymous. I got in. To O'Hare Airport, please. The driver nodded and pulled away. I watched the house recede in the rearview mirror, the brick facade I had paid for, the roof I had repaired, the life I had subsidized. It all shrank until it was just a speck in the distance. I pulled out my phone and opened the airline app. I typed in my destination. Honolulu, Hawaii. One way. First class. I selected a seat. 1A. The window. The flight departed at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. By the time the sun rose over Lake Michigan, I would be at 30,000 feet sipping champagne and watching the world get smaller. And by the time I landed, Brad would be realizing that the $450,000 he thought was his salvation was actually the first shovel of dirt on his grave. I leaned back in the leather seat and closed my eyes. The engine hummed a lullaby of escape. Goodbye, Chicago, I whispered. And good luck, Brad. You are going to need it. It was 8 p.m. I stood in the dark by the window of the guest house, watching the main driveway like a sentry on guard duty. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a fresh white blanket over the yard that muted every sound. A black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb. It was the Uber Black Brad had ordered. The front door of the main house opened and light spilled out onto the snow. Brad stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of a tuxedo I knew he had rented just for tonight. He looked like a man who owned the world. He said something over his shoulder and laughed, a loud braying sound that grated on my nerves. Keisha followed him. She was wearing a long, shimmering silver gown that hugged her figure and a fur stole wrapped around her shoulders. She looked beautiful. She looked like her mother Viola. For a split second, my heart ached with the memory of the woman who would have burned this house to the ground before letting anyone treat me this way. But then Keisha laughed too, linking her arm through Brad's. It was the laugh of a conspirator. They were heading to Le Monde, the most expensive French restaurant in the city, to celebrate their windfall. $450,000, my life savings. They were going to drink champagne and toast to the fact that they had finally squeezed the last drop of blood from the old stone. I waited until they got into the car. I waited until the red taillights faded into the distance, turning the corner at the end of the street. The silence returned heavy and absolute. The house stood looming before me, a monument to my own blindness. I had built it with love, but it was filled with rot. I turned away from the window and walked to the small desk in the center of the room. The blue folder was there. It was just a standard cardstock file folder, the kind you can buy for 50 cents at any supply store. But as I picked it up, it felt heavy, denser than lead. It contained the end of a marriage and the destruction of an ego. I ran my thumb along the edge. I had debated adding a note, maybe a letter explaining why I had done this, but I decided against it. The facts spoke louder than any lecture I could give. The numbers were the only language Brad understood, and the betrayal was the only language that would wake Keisha up. I zipped up my leather duffel bag. I checked my pocket for my passport and the wad of cash. I was ready. I walked out of the guest house, leaving the door unlocked. I wouldn't be coming back. I crossed the snowy yard, my boots crunching softly. I walked up the back steps of the main house and used my key to open the kitchen door. The warmth of the house hit me instantly. It smelled of expensive perfume and the lingering scent of the turkey carcass sitting in the trash. I walked through the kitchen, my eyes scanning the room. The granite countertops I had paid for, the high-end appliances I had installed. It all looked foreign to me now, like a museum exhibit of a life I used to live. I walked into the living room. The 60-inch television was paused on a sports channel. A half-empty bottle of scotch sat on the coffee table next to a coaster they never used. I moved through the house like a ghost haunting the halls of the people who had murdered me. I climbed the stairs to the second floor. I walked past the master bedroom. The door was open, revealing a chaotic mess of clothes thrown on the bed as they had gotten ready. It was a picture of carelessness. They thought they had all the time in the world to clean up. They thought their future was secured. I reached the end of the hall and pushed open the door to Brad's home office. This was the nerve center of his delusions. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and ambition. The walls were lined with framed motivational posters, success is a choice, that he had bought online. His desk was a massive slab of glass and chrome cluttered with energy drink cans and printed spreadsheets of projected earnings that were purely fictional. I walked around the desk. His computer monitors were dark sleeping. I did not need to wake them. I had already extracted the poison I needed. I looked down at his mechanical keyboard, the expensive kind with the backlit keys he loved to click-clack on late at night, pretending to work while he gambled away our future. I placed the blue folder right in the center of the keyboard. I adjusted it so it was perfectly square. The blue cardstock seemed to glow in the dim light coming from the hallway. It was impossible to miss. It would be the first thing he saw when he sat down drunk and happy to check his crypto balance or email his mistress. I stood there for a moment looking at the folder, running through the contents in my mind one last time to make sure I hadn't missed anything. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a surrender. The first document was a transaction history from their joint savings account, the account Keisha contributed to every month from her salary, the nest egg she thought was safe. The balance was zero. The history showed a series of wire transfers over the last 6 months totaling exactly $200,000. The money had been moved to an offshore LLC. The second document was the smoking gun. It was a purchase order I had tracked down through the VIN number registration database. The offshore LLC, Brad's shell company, had purchased a slate gray Porsche 911 Carrera just last week, a $200,000 sports car. But the third document was the knife in the gut. It was the delivery manifest and the registration paperwork. The car hadn't been delivered to this house. It hadn't been delivered to Brad's office. It was registered to an address at the Breathless Luxury Apartments on the north side, Unit 4B, and the name on the registration wasn't Brad. It was Tiffany Jenkins. Tiffany, Keisha's maid of honor, her best friend since 10th grade, the woman who sat at our dinner table every Christmas and Easter, the woman who held Keisha's hand when she cried about Brad being distant, the woman who called me Mr. Reggie and brought me sweet potato pie. Brad wasn't just stealing my daughter's money. He was spending it on the one person Keisha trusted most in the world outside of her husband. He had bought a sports car for his mistress with his wife's savings. I had printed out the text logs too, pages of them. Graphic, brutal messages between Brad and Tiffany mocking Keisha, calling her gullible, talking about how they couldn't wait for the old man to die so they could cash out the inheritance. I put those at the bottom of the stack. I wanted Keisha to see the money first. The money was the hook. The betrayal was the barb. I looked at the folder one last time. It was a bomb. A paper bomb that would detonate the moment it was opened. I almost felt a twinge of pity for Keisha. Almost. She was about to lose her husband, her best friend, her savings, and her home in a single 24-hour period. It would break her. But sometimes you have to break a bone to reset it so it heals straight. She had chosen this path when she chose him over me. Now she had to walk it. I turned and walked out of the office, leaving the door wide open. I descended the stairs, my hand sliding down the banister I had sanded and stained myself. I reached the front door. I paused. I looked back at the house. It was silent. It was waiting. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air rushed into the foyer, meeting the warm air of the house. I pulled the door shut, but I didn't lock it. I left it unlocked just like they always did. Let the wind get in. Let the cold get in. I walked down the steps and down the long driveway. My Uber was waiting at the curb, its engine idling, sending plumes of white exhaust into the night. The driver, a young man with a turban, popped the trunk. I tossed my bag inside. It landed with a soft thud. I climbed into the back seat. The leather was cold against my legs. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "O'Hare Airport," I said, my voice steady. "International Terminal." He nodded and pulled the car into gear. We rolled away from the curb. I looked out the window as we passed the house. I saw the guest house in the backyard, dark and small. I saw the windows of the main house glowing with warmth that wasn't real. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key to the guest house, the key I had carried for 3 years, the key to my cell. I rolled down the window. The freezing wind whipped at my face. I tossed the key out into a snowbank. It disappeared without a sound. "Goodbye, prison," I whispered. The car turned the corner and the house vanished from sight. I didn't look back. I leaned my head against the headrest and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, the knot of anxiety in my chest began to loosen. I was homeless. I was alone. But I was free. The plane would leave at 6 a.m. By the time Brad and Keisha woke up hungover and realized their world had ended, I would be 30,000 feet in the air drinking orange juice and watching the sunrise over the Pacific. The game was over, and I had won. The United Airlines Polaris Lounge was a world away from the drafty guest house I had occupied for 3 years. It smelled of expensive leather-aged mahogany and the faint crisp scent of money. I sat in a high-back wing chair overlooking the tarmac, a glass of 20-year-old Pinot Noir resting on the marble-side table. The wine cost $40 a glass. It was smooth, complex, and rich, everything my life in Chicago had not been. I adjusted the cuff of my charcoal suit. It fit perfectly. I had not worn it since the day I retired from the military, but the fabric seemed to remember my shape. Around me, businessmen and Italian loafers tapped on laptops, and wealthy tourists adjusted their jewelry. No one looked at me with pity. No one saw a freeloading old man. They saw a peer. They saw Reginald King, the man who held patents that held up the world. My phone buzzed against the marble table, vibrating like an angry insect. The screen lit up. The photo I had set years ago flashed a picture of Keisha from her college graduation, smiling and full of hope. Daughter calling. I stared at the screen. My hand hovered over it. For 40 years that ringtone had been a command. When Keisha called, I answered. When she needed money, I wired it. When she needed comfort, I gave it. It was the reflex of fatherhood, a conditioning deeper than any military training. She was probably calling to ask where I was. Or maybe Brad had told her about the check and she was calling to offer a half-hearted thank you before asking when I would be fully moved out. Or maybe, just maybe, she was calling to say she was sorry. The phone buzzed again, insistent, demanding. I picked it up. The metal was cool in my hand. I looked at her smiling face one last time. That girl didn't exist anymore. She had been replaced by a stranger who stood by while her husband called me a dog. I did not slide the green button. I did not decline the call. I pressed the power button on the side of the phone and held it. The screen went black. The smiling girl vanished into the void. But that wasn't enough. I needed to sever the nerve. I popped the case off the back of the phone. My fingers, strong and steady, dug into the side slot. I pulled out the SIM tray. The tiny gold chip glinted under the lounge lights. It contained my number, my contacts, my history with them. I placed the chip between my thumb and forefinger. With a sharp snap, I broke it in two. I stood up and walked over to the trash receptacle by the buffet. I dropped the pieces of plastic into the bin. They fell among the used napkins and coffee grounds. Trash. Just like the way they had treated me. I went back to my seat and took a sip of wine. It tasted like freedom. While I sat there waiting for my flight to be called, I knew exactly what was happening back at the house on Meadow Lane. I knew their routine. I knew their arrogance. I could see it in my mind's eye as clearly as if I were watching the security feed. The black Uber would be pulling into the driveway right about now. The headlights would sweep across the snow, illuminating the front of the house that Brad thought he owned. They would be stumbling out of the car, drunk on expensive champagne and the high of their perceived victory. Brad would be the first one out, loosening his tie, his face flushed. He would look toward the back of the property, toward the guest house. The windows would be dark, no light on the porch, no movement inside. "I bet the old man is already gone," he would say, his voice loud in the quiet neighborhood. "Look at that." Didn't even say goodbye. Keisha would step out shivering in her silver dress, clutching her fur stole. She would look at this dark guest house too. "Is he really gone?" she would ask, a tremor in her voice. Brad would laugh, that braying sound that echoed off the brickwork. "Gone and good riddance, babe. I told you he knew he was beaten. He took the payout and ran, probably halfway to the bus station by now." They would walk up the driveway, their shoes crunching on the ice. Brad would stop and gesture grandly at the guest house. You know what he would say, wrapping an arm around Keisha? "This saves us a fortune. I was going to hire a crew to clear his junk out on Monday. Now all we have to do is call a dump truck. We can have that place gutted by the weekend. Man cave, here I come." Keisha would giggle nervously. "You are terrible, Brad." "I am practical," he would say, kissing her forehead. "Come on, let's go inside. I want to see if he left the keys or if I have to break the lock tomorrow." They would go to the back door, finding it unlocked just as I left it. They would stumble into the kitchen, bringing the cold wind in with them. They wouldn't bother locking it behind them. Why would they? They were untouchable now. They would move through the house, turning on lights, reclaiming their territory. Brad would head straight for the liquor cabinet, pouring himself another drink because $450,000 was a reason to stay drunk for a week. "I'm going to check the office," Brad would shout over the noise of the TV he had just turned on. "Gotta check the crypto markets, see if my luck is holding." He would walk down the hallway, his tuxedo shoes clicking on the hardwood. He would feel invincible. He had the house. He had the money. He had the girl. He had gotten rid of the father-in-law. It was a clean sweep. He would push open the door to his office, expecting to see his empire of debt and delusions exactly as he left it. He would reach for the light switch, flicking it on. And then he would stop. Because sitting there in the center of his black glass desk, illuminated by the overhead light, was a single blue file folder. It wasn't his. He didn't use paper files. He lived in the cloud. The blue was stark alien against the monochrome decor of his room. He would frown. He would take a step forward, his drink sloshing in his glass. He would wonder if Keisha had left it there. A bill maybe, a receipt. He would set his drink down. He would reach out his hand. At O'Hare Airport, the intercom chimed softly. "United Airlines Flight 492 service to Honolulu is now boarding Group 1. I finished my wine. I set the glass down. I picked up my duffel bag. Across town, Brad was opening the folder. His fingers were touching the cool paper. He was flipping it open. He was looking at the first page, the transaction history. The $200,000 he thought he had successfully hidden in the offshore shell company, the money he stole from his wife. He would blink thinking it was a mistake. He would look closer. He would see the dates, the amounts. Then he would turn the page. He would see the invoice for the Porsche, the VIN number, the price tag, and then he would see the name, Tiffany Jenkins. I walked toward the gate, my stride long and purposeful. I handed my boarding pass to the attendant. She scanned it. It beeped a happy confirmation. "Have a wonderful flight, Mr. King," she said, smiling. I smiled back. "I intend to." Back in the office, Brad's heart would be hammering against his ribs. The blood would be draining from his face, leaving him pale and sickly under the fluorescent lights. He would be struggling to breathe. He would look at the door, terrified that Keisha might walk in. He would reach for the folder to hide it, to burn it, to eat it if he had to. But he would be too slow. Because I knew my daughter. I knew that when they got home, she would go to the kitchen to drink water, and then she would come looking for him. She always did. She was needy like that. Just as Brad was trying to shove the papers back into the folder, Keisha would walk into the room. "Babe, who left this folder here?" she would ask, her voice slurring slightly from the wine. And then she would see his face. She would see the terror, the guilt, the absolute panic of a man caught holding the murder weapon. "What is that, Brad?" she would ask, her voice sharpening. "What are you hiding?" I walked down the jet bridge, the tunnel to my new life. I could almost hear the scream from across the city. It wouldn't be a scream of fear. It would be the scream of a woman realizing her entire life was a lie. I stepped onto the plane. The air stewardess greeted me with a hot towel and a glass of champagne. I took my seat, 1A. I stowed my bag overhead. I sat down and buckled the belt. The cabin door closed. The pressure seal hissed. We were sealed in. I looked out the window at the gray Chicago sky. Somewhere down there in that sprawling frozen city, the bomb had just detonated. The shrapnel was flying. The walls were coming down. I raised my glass to the window. "To the truth," I whispered. The engines roared to life. The plane began to move. And as we lifted off, leaving the ground behind, leaving the gravity of my past life below, I felt lighter than air. I was airborne, and they were just beginning to fall. While I was sipping champagne at 30,000 feet, the hell I had engineered was breaking loose on the ground in Chicago. Inside the home office, Brad stared at the documents in the blue folder, his hands trembling so violently the paper rattled like dry leaves in a gale. The alcohol in his system turned to acid. He looked at the bank transfer records, $200,000 gone from the joint savings account. He looked at the invoice for the Porsche 911. He looked at the registration name, Tiffany Jenkins. His face drained of color, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under the heat of his own deception. He couldn't breathe. He clawed at his collar, trying to loosen the tuxedo tie that suddenly felt like a noose. He had to get rid of this. He had to burn it. He reached for the shredder under his desk, his movements frantic and clumsy. But the universe has a sense of timing, and I had set the clock perfectly. Just as Brad shoved the first page toward the teeth of the shredder, the office door swung open. Keisha stood there holding 2 crystal flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. She was smiling, a flush of intoxication on her cheeks. She looked happy. It was the last time she would ever look happy. "Babe." "Who are you hiding from?" she asked, stepping into the room. "Come have a drink. We need to toast to—" She stopped. She saw the terror on his face. She saw the blue folder open on the desk. She saw his hand trying to force a document into the shredder. The smile vanished. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "What is that paper?" "Nothing," Brad said too quickly, his voice cracking. "Just old tax stuff. Cleaning up. You know, new start." He tried to smile, but it looked like a grimace of pain. He pushed the paper down. The shredder whirred. Keisha set the glasses down on the bookshelf. The liquid sloshed over the rims. She took a step forward, her eyes narrowed. She wasn't smart about money, but she was smart about Brad. She knew that look. It was the look he had when he lost $5,000 on a football game and tried to tell her the car needed a new transmission. "Show me," she said, holding out her hand. "Babe, it is boring financial stuff," Brad stammered, trying to body block the desk. "Let's go to the bedroom. I want to celebrate. Show me." Keisha screamed, lunging forward. She was fast. She grabbed the folder from the desk before he could stop her. Papers spilled onto the floor. The photos of him and Tiffany entering the hotel, the bank statements, the car registration. Brad grabbed her wrist. "Give that back, Keisha. Do not read that." She ripped her arm free, her fingernails raking across his hand. She dropped to her knees, picking up the papers. Her eyes scanned them frantically. "Transfer to TJ Consulting," she read out loud. $200,000. August 15th. She looked up at him, confusion warring with panic. "That was the day you said the market crashed. You said we lost that money in the correction." Brad backed away, his hands raised. "It is an investment, Keisha. A shell company, for tax purposes." She picked up the next sheet. The Porsche invoice. Delivery to Tiffany Jenkins. She went still. The room went silent except for the hum of the computer server. She looked at the photo of Brad kissing Tiffany outside the motel. Tiffany, her maid of honor, the woman she texted every day. She stood up slowly. She held the paper like it was a dead thing. "You bought her a car," she whispered. "You stole our life savings, the money for the baby we were supposed to have. And you bought Tiffany a Porsche." Brad's face hardened. The panic was replaced by something uglier, a sneer of pure defensive malice. It was an investment, he said again, but this time his voice was cold. Something you wouldn't understand. Tiffany appreciates fine things. She doesn't nag me about every dime. She supports me. Supports you, Keisha screamed. She is a waitress, Brad. You are supporting her with my money. My father's money. She threw the papers at him. They fluttered around his head like white feathers. She lunged at him, swinging her fists. She connected with his chest, thumping against the rented tuxedo. You bastard, she shrieked. You liar. Get out. Get out of my house. Brad caught her wrists and shoved her back. She stumbled, crashing into the bookshelf. A heavy crystal vase, the one Viola had brought back from Italy, wobbled and fell. Keisha caught it by the neck. This is not your house, Brad shouted, his face twisting into a mask of hate. It is my house. I paid off the mortgage today, remember? I am the one who secured this asset. You are just the name on the deed. You paid it with my father's money, Keisha yelled, tears streaming down her face, ruining the silver gown. He gave that to us. To us. He gave it to get rid of you, Brad spat. He knows you are weak. He knows you are pathetic. He felt sorry for you, Keisha, just like I did. Keisha let out a guttural sound, a noise of pure animal rage. She swung the heavy crystal vase. Brad tried to duck, but he was slow from the whiskey. The vase connected with the side of his head with a sickening crunch. Crystal shattered. Blood sprayed across the motivational poster on the wall behind him. Brad fell back, clutching his ear, blood seeping through his fingers. He looked at his hand, saw the red, and his eyes went black. You stupid cow, he roared. You stupid, useless woman. He advanced on her, ignoring the blood running down his neck. You think I wanted you, he hissed, cornering her against the desk. You think I wanted to marry into this family. I did it for the money. I did it because I thought your old man had millions buried somewhere and I was right. But God, it was hard work pretending to care about you, listening to you whine, watching you try to dress like you have class when everyone knows you are just trash. Keisha pressed herself against the desk, sobbing, shaking her head. No, Brad, you love me. Love you. He laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. I tolerated you. I tolerated your nagging. I tolerated your cheap taste. And I tolerated that senile black bastard of a father you have stinking up my backyard. He used the word then, the word he had never said in front of her but had used 1,000 times in his head. The racial slur hung in the air, heavy and toxic, stripping away the last layer of his disguise. Keisha gasped. Her eyes went wide with shock. She had blinded herself to his subtle racism for years, telling herself he was just old-fashioned or misunderstood. But this was undeniable. He hated her. He hated her father. He hated what they were. You never loved us, she whispered. You just wanted the house. And I got it, Brad snarled, wiping blood from his cheek. I got the house. I got the money. And now I'm going to get rid of you. You are going to sign this place over to me, Keisha, or I swear to God I will ding-dong. The doorbell rang, long and loud. It cut through the violence like a knife. They both froze. Brad was panning, his tuxedo shirt stained red. Keisha was trembling, clutching the edge of the desk, the shards of the vase at her feet. Ding-dong! Brad glared at the door. Who the hell is that? He growled. He grabbed a letter opener from the desk, gripping it like a shank. Stay here, he ordered Keisha. He walked out of the office down the hall, leaving a trail of blood droplets on the hardwood. Keisha followed him, staying a safe distance behind, terrified but unable to look away. Brad threw open the front door. A man stood on the porch. He was short, balding, and wore a cheap windbreaker. He held a clipboard. He looked at Brad's bloody face and the letter opener, but he didn't flinch. He was a process server in Chicago. He had seen worse. Bradford Miller, the man asked. Brad blinked, swaying slightly. Yeah. What do you want? You are served, the man said, thrusting a thick envelope into Brad's bloody hand. What is this? Brad demanded, staring at the packet. Urgent notice to vacate, the man said, turning to walk away. From the landlord, King Holdings, LLC. You have 30 days to get your property off the land. He walked down the steps. Brad stood in the doorway, the cold wind rushing in, freezing the blood on his face. He looked down at the envelope. He saw the name. Reginald King. Keisha stepped up behind him. She looked over his shoulder. She saw the eviction notice. She saw the logo of the company she didn't know existed. The landlord, she whispered. Brad ripped the envelope open. He pulled out the document Judge Vance had drafted. He read the first line. Notice of ground lease termination due to mortgage satisfaction. His hands began to shake again, harder this time. The letter opener clattered to the floor. No, he whispered. No, no, no. He turned to run back to his office, to his computer, to find a way out. But Keisha was blocking the hallway. She wasn't crying anymore. She was looking at him, and then she was looking at the document in his hand. And then, for the first time in her life, she started to laugh. It was a high, broken sound, the sound of a woman watching the world burn and realizing the fire was cleansing. "It is over, Brad," she said. "He didn't give us the money to save us. He gave us the money to evict us." Brad pushed past her, running toward his office, screaming my name, cursing my existence, but I couldn't hear him. I was miles above him, sipping champagne, leaving him to rot in the wreckage he had created. The first domino had fallen, and the rest were already tipping over. Brad stood in the foyer of the house he thought was his kingdom, the cold Chicago wind seeping through the cracks of the door frame, chilling the sweat and blood on his face. He held the thick envelope in his hand like it was a live grenade. The return address was embossed in gold foil. King Holdings, LLC, 1 South Wacker Drive, Chicago, Illinois. It looked corporate. It looked expensive. It looked like authority. Keisha stood behind him, her breathing ragged. She was still in shock from the revelation of the affair, from the violence, but curiosity is a powerful drug. She leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the envelope. "King Holdings," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Brad, why does that say King? My last name is King. Is that my father?" Brad ignored her. He ripped the tab on the envelope, his bloody fingers smearing the pristine white paper. He pulled out a sheaf of legal documents stapled at the top with a heavy blue backing. He skipped the cover letter. He went straight to the bold text at the center of the page. Notice of termination of ground lease agreement. He blinked. He read it again. Ground lease. He looked up at the ceiling, then down at the floorboards, as if trying to understand what the ground had to do with anything. He shook his head. "This is garbage," he muttered. "This is some kind of joke. We own this house. We have the deed. Read the rest," Keisha said. Her voice was sharp, edging toward hysteria. "Read the next paragraph, Brad." He lowered his eyes. "Pursuant to Clause 14B of the Master Ground Lease Agreement dated November 19, 1998, between Reginald King, as trustee of the King Land Trust, herein referred to as lessor, and the homeowners herein referred to as lessee." Brad stopped. 1998. That was before he met Keisha. That was before this house was even built. He continued reading, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "The lessor hereby exercises the right to terminate the leasehold estate effective immediately. This action is triggered by the full satisfaction of the primary mortgage encumbrance upon the improvements situated on the land." He stopped again. Satisfaction of the primary mortgage. The check. The $450,000. "What does that mean?" Keisha demanded, grabbing his arm. "What is a ground lease, Brad?" He shoved her off him, stumbling back into the living room. He fell onto the sofa, the expensive leather groaning under his weight. He looked at the paper, then at the room around him. The realization was hitting him in waves, slow and nauseating. "It means we do not own the land," he said, his voice sounding hollow. "We own the house, Keisha. We own the wood. We own the bricks. We own the drywall and the roof tiles. But we do not own the dirt. Your father owns the dirt." Keisha stared at him. "That is impossible. We have a mortgage. We pay property taxes. We pay taxes on the improvements," Brad snapped, waving the paper. "On the structure. Your father, that sneaky old bastard, he must have put the land in a trust before we built this place. He let us build the house on his land. He leased us the dirt." "So what?" Keisha cried, throwing her hands up. "So he owns the yard. Big deal. We still own the house. He cannot kick us out of a house we own." Brad laughed. It was a dry, broken sound that lacked any humor. "Read the bold print at the bottom, Keisha. Read the remedy." Keisha snatched the papers from his hand. She brought them close to her face, squinting in the dim light. "Upon termination of the ground lease, the lessee is required to surrender the land to the lessor in its original condition. The lessee has 30 days to remove any and all improvements from the premises. Failure to remove said improvements will result in forfeiture of all structures to the lessor. She looked up, her eyes wide with horror. Remove the improvements? Brad, what does that mean? It means, Brad said, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him. It means we have 30 days to pick up this 4,000 square foot brick house and move it somewhere else. Or else he keeps it. Move the house, Keisha shrieked. We cannot move the house, Brad. It is on a concrete foundation. It has a basement. Exactly, Brad whispered. He sat up suddenly, his eyes darting around the room. The mortgage, the check. The old man paid off the mortgage this morning. He grabbed the papers back from Keisha, scanning the fine print again. Clause 14. B. Termination triggered by mortgage satisfaction. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and aged. The mortgage was the only thing protecting the lease. He said, his voice trembling with the magnitude of his stupidity. As long as the bank had a lien on the house, the lease couldn't be terminated because the bank's interest was protected. The bank would never lend money on a house that could be evicted from the land. So there was a clause, a protection clause. The lease is valid as long as there is a mortgage. He looked at Keisha, his eyes wild. He paid it off. He didn't give us that money to help us. He gave us that money to kill the mortgage. Keisha backed away from him, her hands covering her mouth. He tricked us, she whispered. My father. He isn't senile. He isn't confused. He is a shark. Brad roared, throwing the papers across the room. They scattered like white birds falling to the floor. He played us. He sat there this morning, eating his eggs, looking like a kicked puppy, and he handed me the knife to cut my own throat. Brad stood up, pacing the room, kicking at the furniture. $450,000. I thought it was a windfall. I thought I was free. I ran to the bank. I deposited it. I requested the immediate payoff letter. I did exactly what he wanted me to do. He walked over to the window, looking out at the dark yard. Somewhere out there was the property line, the invisible border that defined what he thought was his kingdom. But it wasn't his. It never was. He was just a squatter in a castle built on sand. Keisha sank to the floor amidst the scattered legal papers. She picked up one of the pages. King Holdings, LLC. He has a company, she said quietly. A real estate holding company. Brad, he lived in the guest house. He wore old clothes. He drove that rusted truck. Where did he get a holding company? He has been lying to us, Brad spat, turning from the window. The whole time. The poor old man act, the helpless father act, it was all a cover. He has money, Keisha. Real money. You do not have lawyers who can draft a ground lease like this unless you have serious assets. He looked at the blue folder still sitting on the desk in the other room, the one with the evidence of his affair. Then he looked at the eviction notice on the floor. He knew everything, Brad said. He knew about Tiffany. He knew about the embezzlement. He knew we were trying to commit him. He didn't leave because he was scared, Keisha said, a tear rolling down her cheek. He left because he was finished. He set the timer and walked away. Brad ran his hands through his hair, pulling at the roots. 30 days. We have 30 days. We cannot move this house. We cannot sell it because we don't own the land. We cannot refinance it because the lease is terminated. He looked at Keisha, and for the first time she saw the true depth of his cowardice. This is your fault, he hissed. You told me he was stupid. You told me he was just a laborer. You said he didn't understand contracts. I didn't know, Keisha sobbed. He is my dad. I thought I knew him. You knew nothing. Brad screamed. You let a wolf into our house and you told me it was a sheep. And now look, we are homeless. I am broke, and I am probably going to jail because of that other file. He kicked the coffee table, overturning it. The empty Scotch bottle rolled across the floor, clinking against the hardwood. Fix this, Brad demanded, pointing a shaking finger at her. Call him. Call your father. Beg him. Cry. Do whatever you have to do. Tell him it was all my idea. Tell him you are pregnant. Lie to him, Keisha. Get him to rescind this notice. Keisha looked up at him, her face streaked with mascara and tears. But beneath the sadness there was something else sparking in her eyes. A realization. He won't answer, she said softly. I tried to call him earlier. He didn't pick up. Try again, Brad shouted. Keep trying until he answers. He won't answer. Keisha repeated louder this time, standing up. Don't you get it, Brad? He isn't coming back. He didn't just leave the house. He left us. He saw us for what we are. He saw you stealing. He saw me letting you do it. And he decided he was done. She looked down at the eviction notice. He didn't just evict us from the land, she said, her voice hollow. He evicted us from his life. Brad stared at her, his chest heaving. Then we fight, he snarled. I will hire the best lawyers in the city. I will sue him for fraud. I will sue him for elder abuse. I will drag him through every court in Illinois. With what money? Keisha asked coldly. You spent our savings on a Porsche for your girlfriend. You spent the mortgage payoff on the mortgage. We have nothing, Brad. You have nothing. Brad opened his mouth to scream again, but he stopped. He looked around the room, the expensive furniture, the art, the trappings of the life he thought he had secured. It was all still there physically, but the foundation was gone. The earth had opened up and swallowed it whole. He realized then with a terrifying clarity that the beautiful $450,000 check had been the final nail in his coffin. He had hammered it in himself with a smile on his face. He sank back onto the sofa, covering his face with his hands. The blood from his ear, where the vase had cut him, smeared across his forehead like a mark of Cain. What have we done? He whispered. Keisha didn't answer. She just looked at the dark window, at the reflection of the broken room and the broken marriage. Outside, the wind howled, tearing through the trees on the land that belonged to Reginald King, the land that was rejecting them. 30 days the clock ticked in the silence. 30 days until the end of the world. Monday morning arrived in Chicago with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The weekend had been a blur of screaming matches, broken glass, and sleeping in separate rooms. The house that was no longer theirs felt like a tomb. I knew this because I had checked the security feed one last time before shutting down the server remotely. I saw Brad leave at 7 a.m. He didn't shower, he didn't eat. He just grabbed his briefcase and fled the scene of his failure. He drove to his office in the Loop, seeking refuge in the one place where he still felt like a king. His startup, TechFlow Solutions. It was a company built on buzzwords and borrowed time, but to Brad it was his empire. He thought it was the one thing I couldn't touch. He thought his career was immune to the infection of his personal life. He was wrong. I sat on the lanai of my hotel suite in Maui. The air smelled of plumeria and salt water. The sun was just rising over the Pacific, painting the water in shades of gold and violet. It was paradise. But my attention was focused on the tablet resting on my knees. I had a direct line into Brad's digital life. Brad burst into his office on the 22nd floor. He slammed the door and locked it, telling his assistant to hold all calls. He needed money. He needed a lot of money, and he needed it fast. The eviction notice was ticking. The divorce lawyers were circling. The gambling debts were due. He paced the room, his hands shaking as he poured himself a morning scotch. He looked at the phone. There was one card left to play. The angel. For 5 years, Brad had bragged about his angel investor. He told everyone who would listen about the mysterious venture capital firm Vanguard Holdings that had spotted his genius early on and backed him with a $2 million line of credit. He called them his safety net. He called them his believers. He sat down at his desk and dialed the private number for the director of Vanguard Holdings. I watched the call come in. Not on a switchboard in a Manhattan skyscraper, but on a burner cell phone sitting next to my coffee cup in Hawaii. I let it go to voicemail. I wanted to hear him beg. Pick up. Pick up. Brad whispered, his voice cracking. The automated greeting played. You have reached the private line of Vanguard Holdings. Please leave a message. Brad took a deep breath, trying to sound professional, but the panic bled through every syllable. Hi, it is Brad Miller from TechFlow. Look, I know it is early and I know we are a little behind on the quarterly projections, but we have hit a snag, a cash flow issue, a personal issue really. I need to draw down on the emergency liquidity fund, $50,000. No, make it 100 just to bridge the gap. I have big contracts coming in next month. Huge. Just need a little help to get there. Call me back. Please. It is urgent. He hung up. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, praying to a God he didn't believe in for a miracle he didn't deserve. I took a sip of my Kona coffee. I picked up the burner phone. Brad didn't know that Vanguard Holdings was just a shell company. He didn't know that the board of directors was just me sitting at my kitchen table in the guest house. He didn't know that the millions of dollars pumping life into his mediocre company came directly from my patent royalties. I had funded him because I wanted Keisha to be secure. I wanted my son-in-law to be the man he pretended to be. I gave him every opportunity to succeed. I gave him capital. I gave him runway. And he used it to lease cars, buy suits, and cheat on my daughter. The investment was a failure. It was time to cut my losses. I didn't call him back. I didn't want to hear his voice again. I opened the secure messaging app that Vanguard used for official communications. I typed a single message. Pursuant to Article 5, Section 2 of the Investment Agreement Character Clause violation, investor confidence revoked. The credit facility is hereby terminated effective immediately. All outstanding principal and interest are due and payable upon receipt. I hit send. Then I logged into the corporate banking portal. I had administrative rights. I was the bank. I clicked withdrawal. I drained the operating account. I drained the payroll account. I drained the reserve fund. I moved every single cent back into the trust. In Chicago, Brad's phone pinged. He grabbed it, expecting a confirmation of funds. He read the text. His face went slack. He read it again. Character clause violation, due and payable upon receipt. He scrambled to his computer. He logged into the company bank account. He needed to see the balance. He needed to see the numbers that told him he was still important. The screen loaded. Balance 0. Brad stared at the screen. He hit refresh. 0. He hit refresh again, slamming the mouse against the desk. 0. No, he gasped. No, this is a mistake. This is a glitch. He grabbed the office phone and dialed Vanguard again. On my balcony in Maui, I watched the burner phone light up. I pressed the button to decline the call. Then I powered the phone down. I took out the SIM card. I walked to the railing of the balcony and flicked the tiny piece of plastic over the edge. It fluttered down into the lush tropical garden below, lost forever among the hibiscus flowers. Back in the office, Brad was hyperventilating. He tried to transfer money from the payroll account to cover the overdraft. Declined. He tried to run the company credit card to buy a plane ticket to anywhere. Declined. Then the emails started coming in. Automatic notifications from the bank. Insufficient funds. Check returned. Wire transfer failed. His employees outside the glass walls were starting to talk. They couldn't log into their expense accounts. The vendors were calling. The internet service provider was threatening to cut the connection. The house of cards wasn't just shaking, it was disintegrating. Brad sat frozen in his chair. The silence in his head was deafening. He had lost the house on Friday. He had lost his marriage on Saturday. And now on Monday morning he had lost his empire. And then the realization hit him. It hit him harder than the vase Keisha had thrown. Character clause. How did the investor know about his character? How did a faceless venture capital firm know that he was a liar and a cheat? Why did the wording sound so familiar? He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out the original contract he had signed 5 years ago. He flipped to the signature page. He had never looked closely at it. He had just seen the money and signed. The signature for Vanguard Holdings was a scrawl, illegible, but below it, printed in small standard font, was the name of the authorized representative, R. King. Brad stopped breathing. R. King. Reginald King. He dropped the contract. It fluttered to the floor, landing next to the blue folder he had tried to shred. Reggie, he whispered. It was Reggie, the old man in the backyard, the man he had mocked for wearing work boots, the man he had told to get a job. That man had been paying his salary for 5 years. That man owned his office chair. That man owned the air conditioning he was breathing. Brad stood up. He felt dizzy. The room was spinning. He walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. He saw the building's steel and glass monuments to power, and he realized he was nothing. He was a parasite who had just killed his host. He had called me a freeloader. But I was the foundation. And when you remove the foundation, the structure falls. His phone rang again. It was his CFO. Brad, we have a problem. Payroll just bounced. The whole system is locking up. Who is Vanguard Holdings? We need to call them. Brad didn't answer. He dropped the phone. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. He looked at his reflection in the window. The tuxedo from the night before was wrinkled and stained. His eyes were wild. He looked like a madman. He had 4 hours. 4 hours before the news broke. 4 hours before the employees stormed his office. 4 hours before the creditors came for the furniture. He didn't have 4 hours. He didn't even have 4 minutes. He grabbed his briefcase. He didn't pack his laptop. He didn't pack his files. He just grabbed a bottle of scotch and walked out. He walked past his assistant, who was frantically typing on her phone. "Mr. Miller," she said, standing up. There are people on line 1 and line 2. The bank is on line 3. Take a message, Brad said without breaking stride. Tell them the CEO has resigned. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the down button. He didn't know where he was going. He couldn't go home. He didn't have a home. He couldn't go to Tiffany's. She had blocked his number the second she saw the Porsche wasn't coming. He couldn't go to the bank. He stepped into the elevator and the doors closed, sealing him in a metal box. He pressed the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, his stomach dropped with it. He was falling, and this time there was no safety net. There was no angel investor. There was only the ground rushing up to meet him, and the ground belonged to me. The tropical breeze of Maui felt miles away as I stared at the screen of my tablet. I was sitting on my private terrace, a cup of Kona coffee cooling on the table, but my mind was back in the freezing gray slush of Chicago inside courtroom 402 of the Cook County Circuit Court. I wasn't there in person. I didn't need to be. My high-priced legal team had arranged for a secure video link so I could witness the proceedings without interrupting my retirement. Brad had moved fast. Desperation does that to a man. He had scraped together the last of his hidden cash, probably pawned his watch or begged his parents to hire a lawyer who specialized in contesting wills and guardianships. His name was Attorney Feldman, a man with a cheap suit and a reputation for bullying the elderly. They had filed an emergency injunction to halt the eviction and void the termination of the ground lease. Their argument was simple and vicious. They claimed I was mentally incompetent. I watched the feed. Brad sat at the plaintiff's table. He looked terrible. His eyes were sunken, his skin sallow. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the jittery energy of a cornered rat. He was wearing a suit that looked like he had slept in it because he probably had. Your Honor, Feldman began pacing in front of the bench. We are here to prevent a tragedy. My client, Mr. Miller, has been the primary caregiver for his father-in-law, Mr. Reginald King, for years. Mr. King is 76 years old. He has a documented history of erratic behavior. Just last week, he handed my client a check for nearly $500,000, a check he clearly did not understand the implications of. Now, in a fit of dementia-induced paranoia, he has fled the state and is attempting to evict his own daughter and her husband from their family home. I took a sip of coffee. It was a good narrative. It painted me as the confused benefactor and Brad as the victim of my senility. Brad took the stand. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Mr. Miller Feldman asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Tell the court about Mr. King's mental state on the morning of Black Friday. Brad cleared his throat. He looked at the judge, then at the camera, knowing I might be watching. He looked sad. It was a good performance. He was confused. Brad said, his voice shaking. He was shuffling around the kitchen. He kept forgetting where he was. He handed me the check and said he wanted to help. He was crying. He said he didn't want to be a burden anymore. We took the check because we thought he was lucid. We didn't know he was setting a trap. No sane father would evict his daughter after paying off her house. It is the action of a sick mind. The judge listened impassively. Her name was Judge Harper. I didn't know her personally, but Judge Vance had told me she was fair and she hated liars. She took notes, her face unreadable. So you contend, Feldman continued, that the termination clause in the ground lease should be voided because Mr. King lacked the capacity to execute it. Exactly, Brad said, gaining confidence. He belongs in a care facility. We were trying to arrange that for him. We were trying to help him. This eviction, it is just a symptom of his disease. We are asking the court to grant emergency guardianship to Mr. Miller so he can manage Mr. King's assets and ensure his safety. That was it, the end game. If they got guardianship, they could reverse the eviction, seize my accounts and bring me back to Chicago in handcuffs to be medicated into oblivion. My lawyer stood up. Ms. Sterling, she was sharp, elegant, and terrifying. She didn't pace. She stood still as a statue. Your Honor, Ms. Sterling said, her voice cool and crisp. The defense disputes the plaintiff's characterization of events. We also dispute the plaintiff's character. We believe this lawsuit is not about Mr. King's health, but about Mr. Miller's debts. Objection, Feldman shouted. Irrelevant. Goes to motive, Your Honor, Ms. Sterling countered, and we have evidence to support it. Aloud, Judge Harper said, leaning forward. Ms. Sterling picked up a remote control. We would like to submit into evidence Exhibit A, a video recording taken from the security system inside the plaintiff's home dated the night of Thanksgiving. Brad froze in the witness chair. He looked at his lawyer. He looked at the screen. He didn't know about the cameras. He thought he was safe in his own house. The large monitor in the courtroom flickered to life. The image was crystal clear. It showed the living room of the house on Meadow Lane. Brad and Keisha were on the couch, champagne glasses in hand. The timestamp was 11 p.m., Thanksgiving night. The audio filled the courtroom. Brad's voice booming and arrogant. Look at him. He is hoarding resources he does not use. He sits on that pile of cash, his pension, whatever little he has while we drown. It is selfish. We are doing him a favor. The state will take better care of him than we can. And once the guardianship goes through, we can liquidate his assets to cover the business loans. The courtroom went silent. On the screen, Keisha asked about the morality of lying to a judge. And Brad's reply echoed off the mahogany walls. It is not lying, babe. It is necessary. He is just a tired old dog ready to be put down. Brad's face on the witness stand turned a ghostly white. He gripped the railing of the box, his knuckles popping. Ms. Sterling let the video play. It cut to the phone call Brad made outside the guest house, the one where he talked to Dr. Miller about the affidavit. Just get the judge to rubber stamp the emergency guardianship. I want access to his accounts by noon on Monday. The house is practically sold. The land value alone covers my spread with the bookies in Vegas. Ms. Sterling paused the video. The image of Brad's face twisted in greed was frozen on the screen, looming over the real Brad who looked like he wanted to vomit. Ms. Sterling turned to the judge. Your Honor, as you can hear, the plaintiff was not concerned about my client's health. He was concerned about gambling debts. He conspired to commit fraud, perjury, and elder abuse. He is not a concerned caregiver. He is a predator who got caught. Feldman was frantically shuffling papers, trying to find an objection, trying to find a way out, but there was no way out. The evidence was absolute. Brad stammered into the microphone. That is out of context. I was stressed. I didn't mean it. Judge Harper raised a hand, silencing him. She looked at Brad over her glasses. Her expression was one of pure disgust. Mr. Miller, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. In my 20 years on the bench, I have seen many things, but I have rarely seen such a naked display of malice and greed. You came into my court, swore an oath, and lied to my face to steal from a man you claim to love. She slammed her gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot. The motion for emergency guardianship is denied with prejudice. The request to void the lease termination is denied. The eviction stands. You have 20 remaining days to vacate the property. Brad slumped in his chair, defeated. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, her eyes hard as flint. Based on the video evidence presented today regarding the conspiracy to fabricate medical records and the intent to defraud a senior citizen, I am holding you in contempt of court. Bailiffs, take Mr. Miller into custody. Brad's head snapped up. What? No, you can't. This is a civil case. It just became a criminal one, Judge Harper said. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office with a recommendation to press charges for conspiracy fraud and attempted elder abuse. Two bailiffs moved in, grabbing Brad by the arms. He struggled, his eyes wild. This is a mistake, he screamed as they hauled him up. I am a businessman. I am a CEO. You can't do this. And one more thing, Judge Harper said, her voice cutting through his shouting. I am forwarding this ruling to the state licensing board. A man who defrauds his own family has no business running a company. Your business license is hereby suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The bailiffs dragged him out. I watched on my screen as he was pulled through the double doors, kicking and screaming, his suit jacket tearing, his dignity left in a puddle on the floor. The courtroom emptied out. Ms. Sterling gathered her files, looking directly into the camera lens, giving me a small professional nod. I sat back in my chair on the terrace in Maui. The sun was fully up now, warming my face. The birds were singing. Brad had lost the house. He had lost his freedom. And now he had lost his ability to make a living. He was stripped bare. I closed the tablet. I took a deep breath of the salty air. It was over. The legal battle was won. But the war wasn't quite finished. There were still loose ends. There was still Tiffany. And there was still Keisha. I stood up and walked to the railing. Below me, the ocean crashed against the rocks, eternal and unyielding. I felt a kinship with it. I had been patient. I had been calm. And when the time came, I had been a force of nature. I went back inside to pour another cup of coffee. My phone pinged. It was an email from the private investigator I had hired to watch Tiffany. Subject line leverage. I opened it. A slow smile spread across my face. Brad thought he had hit rock bottom in that courtroom. He was about to find out that the bottom had a basement, and Tiffany was holding the key. It was raining in Chicago again, a cold, miserable drizzle that coated the city in a sheen of gray. From my vantage point in the tropics, I could only imagine the chill, but I knew exactly how cold it felt to be Brad Miller at that moment. He had been released on his own recognizance pending the criminal investigation, but his passport had been surrendered and his assets were frozen solid. He walked out of the precinct not as a CEO, but as a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a wallet full of useless plastic. He stood on the sidewalk shivering. He couldn't go back to the house on Meadow Lane. The locks had been changed by my security team an hour after the court hearing, and an armed guard was parked in the driveway. He couldn't go to his parents. They had stopped taking his calls after the first news report aired labeling him a predator. He had one lifeline left, one person who he believed truly loved him for him and not his money. Tiffany. I watched the GPS tracker on his phone moving slowly north toward the Gold Coast. He was walking. He didn't have the fare for a cab, and his Uber account was linked to the frozen card. It was a 5-mile walk in the rain. I poured myself another glass of iced tea and settled in to wait. I knew what he would find when he got there because I had arranged the welcoming committee myself. 2 hours later, Brad arrived at the Breathless Luxury Apartments. He looked like a drowned rat. His suit was ruined, his hair plastered to his skull. He pushed past the doorman, who wrinkled his nose at the smell of sweat and desperation, and jabbed the elevator button for the 4th floor. He thought he was going home to a sanctuary. He thought he was going to the woman who understood his genius. He knocked on door 4B. Tiffany opened it. She was wearing a silk robe, looking fresh and expensive, the kind of look that costs $1,000 to maintain. She didn't step back to let him in. She stood in the doorway, blocking his path. Babe, Brad gasped, trying to push past her. Thank God. You have no idea what happened. The old man, he is crazy. He set me up. They froze everything. I need a drink. I need to sit down. Tiffany didn't move. She looked him up and down, her lip curling in a sneer of pure distaste. You look disgusting, Brad. Don't come in. You will drip on the carpet. Brad blinked, water dripping from his nose. What? Tiff, it is me. I need help. I need cash. Just until I straighten this out. We can sell the Porsche. I bought it for you, remember? It is in your name. We can liquidate it and use the cash to hire a real lawyer. Tiffany laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a sharp metallic sound like coins hitting a glass table. Sell my car? She asked, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Why would I sell my car to help you? Because we are partners, Brad pleaded, his voice rising in panic. Because I love you. Because I left my wife for you. Look, I know things look bad right now, but I have a plan. I just need a stake. 50 grand. That is all. The Porsche is worth way more than that. Just give me 50 and you keep the rest. Tiffany crossed her arms. She leaned against the door frame, looking bored. Brad, you are not listening. The Porsche isn't going anywhere. And neither are you. Except maybe to prison. Brad stared at her. He couldn't process what was happening. His narcissism wouldn't allow him to see the truth. He still thought he was the prize. Babe, stop joking. I am cold. Let me in. No, Tiffany said flatly. You are not coming in. And we are not partners. We never were. You were a meal ticket, Brad, and the meal is over. She reached behind her onto the entry table and picked up a thick white envelope. She held it up. Do you know what this is? She asked. Brad shook his head, his eyes fixed on the envelope. It is a cashier's check, Tiffany said, smiling cruelly. For $50,000, delivered by a private courier this morning, from a Mr. Reginald King. Brad felt his knees buckle. He grabbed the doorframe to hold himself up. Reggie. Yeah, Reggie, Tiffany said. He made me an offer, Brad, a business proposition. He said he would give me $50,000 cash tax-free if I did one simple thing. What Brad whispered. If I handed over everything Tiffany said, her eyes gleaming, every text message, every email, every voicemail you ever sent me, All the proof of where the money went. All the proof that you were conspiring to defraud him. She reached back again and picked up a flash drive. I gave it all to him, Brad. Or rather, I gave it to his daughter's lawyer. The courier picked it up an hour ago. Brad made a sound like a wounded animal. You sold me out. For 50 grand. I gave you a Porsche. I gave you diamonds. I gave you everything. Tiffany shrugged. Yeah, and you did it with stolen money. The lawyer told me that if I didn't cooperate, I could be named as an accessory to fraud. I could lose the car. I could go to jail. But if I cooperate, I get immunity. I get to keep the car, and I get a $50,000 bonus from your father-in-law. It was a no-brainer, Brad. She looked at him with eyes devoid of any emotion other than calculation. Besides, she added, twisting the knife, you are broke. You are a loser. I don't date losers. I date winners. And looking at the scoreboard, Reginald King is winning by a mile. No, Brad shouted, lunging for her. You bitch. You can't do this. Tiffany didn't flinch. 2 large men appeared from the hallway inside the apartment. They were private security. I had paid for them too. They stepped in front of her, blocking Brad's path. Get him out of here, Tiffany said, waving her hand dismissively. And if he comes back, call the cops. The security guards grabbed Brad by the arms. He struggled, screaming and crying, begging her to reconsider, begging her to remember their nights together, their plans, their love. Love, Tiffany scoffed as the guards dragged him toward the elevator. Brad, I never loved you. I loved your credit limit, and now that is 0, so you are 0. They threw him into the elevator. The doors closed on his screaming face. Tiffany stood in the hallway for a moment, smoothing her robe. Then she looked directly at the security camera in the hall, the one I had hacked into hours ago. She winked. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. King, she said. Then she went back into her apartment and closed the door. Down on the street, the elevator doors opened and the guards threw Brad out onto the wet pavement. He landed hard, scraping his hands on the concrete. He lay there in the rain for a long time. The passers-by stepped around him, looking at him with mixture of pity and disgust, assuming he was just another drunk. He slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position. He checked his pockets. He had his phone, but the battery was dead. He had his wallet. He opened it. He pulled out his platinum credit card, the one he used to buy the world. There was a bodega on the corner. He stumbled toward it. He needed water. He needed a moment to think. He walked in, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler. He went to the counter. $2, the clerk said. Brad handed him the platinum card. The clerk swiped it. Declined. Brad felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Try it again. It is a platinum card. There is no limit. The clerk swiped it again. Declined. Pickup card. The clerk looked at him. System says I gotta keep the card, buddy. Fraud alert. No. Brad gasped, trying to grab it back. Give it to me. That is mine. Get out of here before I call the police. The clerk shouted, reaching for a bat behind the counter. Brad backed away, hands raised. He turned and ran out of the store. He stood on the corner of State Street and Division, shivering in the rain. He had no money, no car, no home, no wife, no mistress. He looked up at the skyscrapers disappearing into the mist. He had wanted to be a titan of industry. He had wanted to be a player. Now he was a ghost. And thousands of miles away, I closed my laptop. The dismantling was complete. He wasn't just broken financially. He was broken spiritually. He knew now that his entire worth as a human being had been tied to a bank account number that no longer existed. He knew that the love he thought he had found was just a transaction. I had not just defeated him, I had erased him. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer. It is done, I said. He is on the street. Good, Miss Sterling replied. The police have issued a warrant for his arrest based on the evidence Ms. Jenkins provided. They will pick him up within the hour. He will spend tonight in a cell. Let him sit there, I said. Let him think about the view from the bottom. I hung up. I felt a profound sense of closure. The tumor had been cut out. The infection was gone. Now all that was left was the healing. But healing is painful. And for Keisha, the pain was just beginning. She was alone in a house with no power, no heat, and a husband who was about to become a felon. She was about to find out what rock bottom felt like. And I was not going to send a ladder down. Not yet. She needed to learn how to climb. The sun rose over Haleakala Crater, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, a dramatic masterpiece that felt almost too beautiful to be real. I stood on the soft white sand of Wailea Beach, my bare feet grounded in the earth. The air here was different. It was thick and sweet-smelling of salt spray and plumeria, not the exhaust fumes and frozen concrete of Chicago. It filled my lungs without fighting me. I shifted my weight, sinking into my hips, and raised my hands slowly. Tai Chi was a discipline I had picked up in the service, a way to quiet the noise of artillery that lingered in my head long after the guns went silent. For the last 3 years I had practiced in the cramped space of the guest house, careful not to bump into the walls, always aware of Brad watching from the main house, mocking the crazy old man doing his karate chops. Here I had the whole ocean. I moved into Part the Wild Horse's mane. My breathing synchronized with the crash of the waves. Inhale, exhale. I felt the tension in my shoulders, the permanent knot of anxiety I had carried since Viola died begin to loosen. I was not a squatter here. I was not a burden. I was just a man breathing. Very good form, a voice said softly from behind me. Your weight distribution is excellent. I finished the movement, lowering my hands and turning slowly. A woman was sitting on a piece of driftwood a few yards away. She had a book on her lap, but she was watching me. She was a black woman around my age with silver hair cropped close to her head and skin that glowed in the morning light. She wore a simple linen tunic and loose pants. She looked regal, like a queen in exile. Thank you, I said. It has been a while. I am a little rusty. You are not rusty, she said, smiling. You are heavy, not in body, in spirit. You move like a man carrying a loaded rucksack. I looked at her, surprised by her candor. Most people looked right through me. I suppose I am. I just dropped a very heavy load back on the mainland, but the phantom weight is still there. She nodded, closing her book. It takes time for the muscles to realize they do not have to fight anymore. I am Elena, Reggie, I said, walking over to her. Reginald. She offered a hand. Her grip was firm, cool, and dry. Nice to meet you, Reginald. Are you visiting or escaping? I laughed, a short bark of a sound that startled a nearby sandpiper. Is it that obvious? Elena shrugged. Hawaii is full of two kinds of people. Those who are here to take photos for their friends back home, and those who are here because they have nowhere else to go. You do not have a camera, and you look like you just walked out of a burning building. I sat down on the sand near her. Not a burning building, I said, looking out at the horizon where a humpback whale breached, crashing back into the sea. A collapsing bridge. I was the engineer, and I was the demolitionist. Elena hummed a thoughtful sound. I was a history professor at Columbia for 40 years. I taught the rise and fall of empires. Do you know the one thing every collapsed empire has in common? What I asked. They all thought they were eternal, she said. They all thought the walls would hold forever, but rot starts from the inside. By the time the barbarians are at the gate, the city has already fallen. I thought of Brad. I thought of his arrogance, his belief that his little kingdom was unassailable while he rotted it out with greed and lies. You sound like you have seen a few empires fall, I said. A few, Elena said, her eyes distant. My husband was a diplomat. We lived in places where the maps changed every 10 years. I learned that the only thing you can really build that lasts is your own peace. That is why I am here, to tend to my garden and watch the sunrise. We sat in silence for a long time. It was a comfortable silence. No demands, no expectations. Just two survivors watching the world turn. I haven't had a conversation like this in years, I admitted. My daughter, she and I, we don't talk. Not really. She talks at me. Or she used to. Elena looked at me, her dark eyes sharp. Used to. I left, I said simply. I cut the cord. It was killing me, Elena. The disrespect, the entitlement. I felt like I was fading away, like I was just a wallet with a pulse. And now she asked. Now, I said, taking a deep breath of the ocean air. Now I feel solid again. I feel like I exist. Good, Elena said. Never apologize for saving your own life, Reginald. Children are supposed to grow wings and fly. They are not supposed to eat the nest and the parents with it. I looked at her, and for the first time in a decade I felt a spark. Not just of attraction, though she was a beautiful woman, but of connection, of being understood. Back in Chicago, I was just the old man in the backyard, the nuisance, the relic. Here with this stranger who read history books at dawn, I was Reginald, I was interesting. I was valid. Would you like to get coffee? I asked, gesturing toward the hotel. They have a Kona blend that costs more than my first car, but it is worth it. Elena laughed, a rich, warm sound that made me smile. I would love to, but I am buying. I have a feeling you have paid enough bills lately. I smiled back. You have no idea. We stood up, brushing the sand from our clothes. As we walked toward the hotel path, talking about history and architecture and the best way to brew coffee, I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't thought about Keisha for an hour. For the last 3 years, every waking moment had been consumed by her. Worrying about her finances, worrying about her marriage, worrying about her opinion of me. She had occupied my mind like an invading army. But walking here with Elena, listening to her talk about the fall of Rome, Keisha was gone. Brad was gone. The anger, the resentment, the constant low-level hum of pain. It was silent. I felt a lightness in my chest that was almost dizzying. I was not just free physically. I was beginning to be free mentally. I was reclaiming the real estate of my own mind. We reached the patio of the hotel. I pulled out a chair for Elena. She sat down with a grace that spoke of years of diplomatic dinners. "So, Reginald," she said, leaning forward, her eyes twinkling, "you said you were a demolitionist. What did you blow up?" I sat down. "A life," I said. "A fake life. I blew up the lies. I blew up the enabling. And I think I blew up my relationship with my daughter permanently." Sometimes, Elena said softly, "Rubble is the only place you can build something new." I was about to answer, to tell her about the veterans' home I planned to build on the land, about the future I was starting to see for myself, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It wasn't the old phone. It was the new satellite-secure smartphone I had bought at the airport. Only one person had this number. "Excuse me," I said. I pulled the phone out. There was a single notification. An encrypted email from Ms. Sterling, my lawyer in Chicago. I hesitated. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to let the old world intrude on this perfect morning. I wanted to stay in the bubble with Elena and talk about history. But I was a soldier, and soldiers check the perimeter. I opened the email. There was no subject line, just a short message. "Mr. King, the assets have been seized. The suspect is in custody. The mistress has turned state's evidence. The daughter has been served with the final vacate order. She is currently in the house with no utilities. She has requested a meeting to negotiate terms of surrender. The fish is on the chopping block. How do you want to cook it?" I stared at the screen. The fish is on the chopping block. Brad was in a cell. Keisha was in the cold. They were broken. They were defeated. I held their fate in my hands. I could tell Ms. Sterling to show mercy. I could tell her to give Keisha a small stipend enough to rent a studio apartment. I could tell her to drop the charges against Brad, let him fade away into obscurity. Or I could finish it. I could let the law take its course. I could let the winter do its work. I could let them feel the full crushing weight of the world they had tried to build on my back. I looked up at Elena. She was watching me, sipping her water, waiting. She didn't ask who it was. She respected my silence. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. I looked at the ocean. I looked at the palm trees swaying in the breeze. I looked at the woman sitting across from me, a woman who saw me as a man, not a bank account. I looked back at the phone. I typed a reply. "Let it burn. No negotiations. Proceed with full prosecution. And send the eviction crew in the morning." I hit send. I put the phone face down on the table. The screen went black. "Everything is fine," I said to Elena. "Just closing the book on an old empire." She smiled. "Good. Now tell me, Reginald, have you ever been to the road to Hana?" "I haven't," I said, leaning back and letting the sun warm my face. "But I have plenty of time." I picked up the menu. The past was dead. The future was sitting right in front of me. And for the first time in a long time, I was hungry. I sat in the back of a convertible Mustang, driving down the Hana Highway, the wind whipping through my hair, the lush green cliffs of Maui rising on one side and the endless blue ocean on the other. Elena was driving, wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf, looking like a movie star from the golden age of Hollywood. We were laughing about something trivial, the kind of easy laughter that comes when you have left your burdens behind. But the past has a way of reaching out like a vine, trying to strangle a new sapling. My phone, the satellite secure one, began to vibrate in my pocket. It was a distinctive ringtone, one I had set specifically for emergency contacts from the old life, a number I hadn't changed because it was tied to the security system. I pulled it out. The screen flashed, "Home security breach, incoming call." It wasn't an intruder. It was Keisha. She had found the emergency landline in the basement, the old rotary phone I kept for power outages. It was the only line that wasn't disconnected because it ran on a separate copper wire circuit I had installed myself. I looked at Elena. She glanced at the phone, then back at the road. "Do you need to take that?" she asked, her voice neutral. I hesitated. I could let it ring, I could throw the phone into the jungle, but curiosity is a powerful vice. I wanted to hear her. I wanted to know if she had learned anything. "Just a moment," I said. I answered the call, putting it on speaker but keeping the volume low. "Hello?" My voice was calm, steady, betraying nothing of the turmoil I had felt just days ago. "Dad. Oh my God, Dad." Keisha's voice burst through the speaker, hysterical, broken, wet with tears. "Dad, please, you have to help me. I don't know where you are, but you have to come home. It's a nightmare here." I watched the palm trees blur past. "I am not coming home, Keisha. What do you want?" "Dad, Brad, he lied to me," she sobbed, her breath hitching. "He stole everything. He had a mistress. He bought her a Porsche with our savings. He ruined us, Dad. I am a victim here. I didn't know anything. You have to believe me." She sounded desperate. She sounded like the little girl who used to scrape her knee and come running to me for a bandage and a kiss. For a split second, my instinct was to comfort her, to tell her I would fix it, to tell her I would send money, send lawyers, send help. But then I remembered the video. I remembered her sitting on the couch sipping champagne, agreeing that I was a tired old dog who needed to be put down. "You are not a victim, Keisha," I said, my voice hardening like concrete setting in the sun. "I am," she screamed. "He manipulated me. He told me it was for the best. He said you were sick. I just wanted to help you." "Help me." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "By signing an affidavit declaring me mentally incompetent, by agreeing to put me in a state-run facility known for abuse. By planning to sell the land I bought with my blood and sweat to pay off your husband's gambling debts." There was a silence on the line, a beat of shock. How do you know about the affidavit?" she whispered. "I have cameras, Keisha," I said. "I have had them for years. I saw everything. I heard everything. I heard you call me a burden. I heard you agree that the best gift would be for me to disappear. Well, I gave you your gift. Why aren't you happy?" "Dad, no, that was the wine talking. That was Brad putting ideas in my head." Her voice rose in pitch, frantic scrambling for a foothold on a cliff that was crumbling away. "I love you. You're my father. You can't leave me here with nothing. The power is out. The heat is off. It's freezing. I have nowhere to go." "You have a husband," I said. "Or you did. I assume he is currently unavailable." "He's in jail," she wailed. "They arrested him, Dad. Please, just send money for a hotel. Just send money for a lawyer. I'll divorce him. I'll testify against him. I'll do whatever you want. Just come back and fix this." "I am fixing it," I said. "I am fixing the mistake I made 30 years ago when I started shielding you from every consequence. I am letting you feel the cold, Keisha. I am letting you feel the dark. Because that is the only way you will ever learn to build your own fire." "You can't do this," she shrieked, the veneer of the victim cracking to reveal the entitlement beneath. "It's cruel. It's abuse. I am your daughter. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice cold as the Chicago wind. "I gave you life. I gave you an education. I gave you a home. And you tried to take my dignity. You tried to take my freedom. You signed that paper, Keisha. You held the pen. Brad may have loaded the gun, but you pulled the trigger." "Dad." "Goodbye, Keisha," I said. "Figure it out. You're smart. You're young. Use the degree I paid for. Get a job. Rent a room. Start over. But do not call this number again. The next time we speak, it will be through my lawyers." Daddy, please don't hang up. I'm scared." I pressed the red button. The line went dead. I sat there for a moment staring at the phone. The silence of the car was heavy. Elena reached over and placed her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer platitudes. She just offered her presence, solid and warm. "That was hard," I said, my voice rough. "Surgery is always hard," Elena said softly. "But you cut out the rot. If you hadn't, it would have killed you both." I nodded. I looked out at the ocean again. The waves were crashing against the rocks, relentless cleansing. Keisha was alone in the dark. She was cold. She was scared. Good. Fear was a teacher. Hunger was a motivator. She would either sink or she would swim. But for the first time in her life, she would have to do it without my life jacket. I put the phone away. I took a deep breath of the tropical air. "Drive," I said to Elena. "I want to see the waterfalls." She smiled behind her sunglasses and pressed the accelerator. The Mustang surged forward, leaving the shadow of my past behind, speeding toward a future that was finally truly mine. Brad sat in the corner of a dingy coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He was hunched over his laptop using the free public Wi-Fi because his data plan had been cut off an hour ago. He looked terrible. The rented tuxedo was gone, replaced by a stained tracksuit he must have dug out of his gym bag in the trunk of his car before it was repossessed. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. He smelled of fear and stale sweat. He was trying to move money. He was trying to find the crumbs he had scattered across the internet in various crypto wallets and offshore betting accounts. He thought he was being clever. He thought he could scrape together enough cash to buy a fake passport and a bus ticket to Mexico. He was frantically typing, trying to liquidate the few assets he had managed to hide from Keisha and from the initial freeze order. He was trying to sell a watch collection he had stashed in a safety deposit box under a fake name. He was trying to transfer the remaining balance of a slush fund he called the Rainy Day. He didn't know that it wasn't just raining. It was a hurricane. And the eye of the storm was hovering right over his head. I watched him from my terrace in Maui. I wasn't looking at a security camera feed this time. I was looking at a financial dashboard provided to me by my forensic accountant. I could see every keystroke Brad made. I could see every desperate attempt to launder the last few dollars of his stolen empire. He didn't understand that for the last 10 years, while I was playing the role of the silent grandfather, I was also the silent auditor. As the primary investor in his company, I had rights he never bothered to read in the fine print. I had access to the raw data. I saw every expense report. I saw every invoice. I saw the business trip to Miami that was actually a week-long party with Tiffany. I saw the office supplies that were actually diamond earrings. I saw the consulting fees paid to companies that didn't exist, companies that were just bank accounts in the Cayman Islands controlled by him. He had treated his company like a personal piggy bank. He had treated the IRS like a suggestion box. He hadn't paid payroll taxes in 3 years. He had claimed deductions for a yacht he didn't own. He had built a mountain of tax fraud so high it was visible from space. And 2 days ago, I had sent a very large, very detailed package to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. It contained everything: the ledgers, the emails, the bank transfers. It was a roadmap to prison wrapped in a bow. Brad hit enter on his keyboard, trying to wire $5,000 to a new account. The screen buffered. The little circle spun round and round. Come on, he muttered, hitting the table with his fist. Suddenly a shadow fell over his table. Brad looked up. 2 men and a woman stood there. They weren't wearing police uniforms. They were wearing navy blue windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back. They looked like accountants who could break your legs. "Bradford Miller?" the woman asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. Brad slammed his laptop shut. "Who wants to know?" "Special Agent Miller, IRS Criminal Investigation Division," she said, holding up a badge. "We have a warrant for the seizure of all electronic devices and financial records in your possession." Brad stood up, knocking his chair over. "IRS. You guys have the wrong guy. I am just doing some freelance work. I don't have any records." The agent didn't blink. "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Miller. And we know about the Cayman accounts. We know about the shell companies. We know about the Porsche written off as a company vehicle. We know about the $3 million in unreported income over the last decade." Brad's mouth opened and closed. $3 million. He hadn't realized it was that much. He had spent it as fast as he stole it. "This is harassment," he stammered, backing away. "I want my lawyer." "You can call your lawyer from the federal building," the agent said. "But right now, you need to hand over the laptop and the phone." Brad clutched the computer to his chest. "No. This is private property. You can't just take it." The 2 male agents stepped forward. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't have to. Their presence filled the small coffee shop. The other patrons were staring, holding their lattes, watching the show. "Mr. Miller," the woman said, stepping closer, This is not a request. You are currently under investigation for tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. We have authorization to seize any assets suspected to be proceeds of these crimes. That laptop was purchased with company funds. That phone was paid for by company funds. Hand them over. Brad looked at the exit. It was blocked by a third agent. He looked at the window. It was plate glass. He was trapped. He handed over the laptop. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He handed over the phone. Now the agent said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Bradford Miller, you are under arrest." "Arrest?" Brad squeaked. "For taxes. People don't get arrested for taxes. They get fines." "People who make mistakes get fines," the agent said, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. "People who systematically defraud the United States government for 10 years go to federal prison." "You are looking at 20 years, Mr. Miller. Minimum." They marched him out of the coffee shop. It wasn't the dramatic exit he had made from the courtroom. This was worse. This was bureaucratic. This was cold. He was shoved into the back of an unmarked sedan. No sirens, no lights. Just the quiet efficiency of the federal government coming to collect its due. I watched the GPS signal on his phone die as they put it into a Faraday bag. I took a sip of my coffee. The silence was beautiful. But I wasn't done. The arrest was just the beginning. The real pain was what happened next. As Brad sat in the interrogation room at the federal building, staring at the two-way mirror stripped of his belt and his shoelaces, he was still hoping for a miracle. He was hoping that he had one account left. One secret stash that I hadn't found. One credit card that still worked. He needed bail money. He needed a lawyer who cost more than a public defender. He asked for his one phone call. He didn't call Keisha. He didn't call his parents. He called the automated line for his last secret bank account. The one he had opened under his mother's maiden name. The one where he had stashed $50,000 just last week. He held the receiver to his ear, his hand trembling. He punched in the account number. He punched in the PIN. "Please wait while we access your account," the robotic voice said. Brad closed his eyes. "Just let it be there. Just let me have this one thing." "Current balance," the voice said. $0.00. Brad dropped the receiver. It swung on its metal cord, banging against the wall. Zero. I had found that account too. It wasn't hard. He used the same password for everything. I had flagged it to the forensic accountants as part of the audit package. The IRS had frozen it 10 minutes before they walked into the coffee shop. They had seized it as evidence of money laundering. Brad slid down the wall of the holding cell. He curled into a ball on the concrete floor. He had nothing. No money. No assets. No friends. Even his secrets had been taken from him. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting a bad run of luck. He was fighting a god. He was fighting someone who saw everything, who knew everything, who could reach out from across the ocean and turn off his life like a light switch. He thought about the man in the guest house, the man he had called a burden. He realized now that the burden had been the only thing holding up the sky. And now the sky had fallen. Brad began to weep, not the angry tears of the courtroom. These were the terrified tears of a child who realizes he is alone in the dark. Back in Maui, I closed the banking window on my tablet. I opened my email. There was a message from the IRS agent assigned to the case. A simple automated confirmation that the evidence package had been received and processed. I archived the email. I looked out at the ocean. The waves were relentless. They didn't care about Brad. They didn't care about his ambition or his greed. They just kept coming, washing away everything in their path. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't joy. It wasn't happiness. It was balance. The scales had been tipped for so long, and now they were level. Brad would spend the next few years in a federal facility. He would have plenty of time to think about the choices he had made. He would have plenty of time to think about the old man he had underestimated. But my work wasn't done. There was still one piece left on the board. One person who was still sitting in the ruins of the house on Meadow Lane waiting for a savior who wasn't coming. Keisha. She was alone now. Her husband was in federal custody. Her house was being repossessed. Her utilities were cut. She was sitting in the cold, just like she had wanted me to do. It was time for the final lesson, the hardest lesson of all. The deadline came and went with the merciless precision of a countdown timer. Day 30, the end of the grace period. In the legal world, deadlines are not suggestions, they are cliffs, and Keisha had been dancing on the edge for a month, hoping that gravity would make an exception for her. She thought that if she just stayed put, if she just refused to acknowledge the reality of the eviction, that I would eventually crack. She thought that her father, the man who had always been her safety net, would swoop in at the last minute and catch her. She was wrong. I was not coming back. I was not sending money. I was sending a siege. I watched the scene unfold from my tablet in Maui. The security cameras in the house were offline now, their power source cut, but I had eyes on the ground. I had hired a private security firm, Titan Security, a company run by ex-military contractors who specialized in asset recovery and high-risk evictions. They were not there to drag her out kicking and screaming. That would be messy. That would be illegal. They were there to secure the perimeter. At 8 a.m. sharp, 3 black SUVs rolled up to the curb on Meadow Lane. 6 men in tactical gear got out. They did not knock on the door. They did not ask for permission. They went straight to work. From the back of a truck, they unloaded sections of chain-link fencing 8 feet high, topped with razor wire. They began to erect a perimeter around the property line. The sound of metal clanging against metal echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, whispering and pointing. This was not a normal eviction. This was a military operation. Inside the house, Keisha must have heard the noise. She must have looked out the window and seen the fence going up piece by piece, enclosing her in a cage of her own making. She probably ran to the door expecting to find a sheriff with a notice. Instead, she found a wall of steel. She opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch in her pajamas, shivering in the cold morning air. "What are you doing?" she screamed at the men. "You can't do this. This is my house." The team leader, a man named Stone with a face like carved granite, did not even look up from his clipboard. "We are securing the property, ma'am, per the instructions of the landowner. You are currently trespassing on private land. You are free to leave at any time through the pedestrian gate, but no vehicles are allowed in or out, and once you leave, you cannot return." Trespassing, Keisha shrieked. "I live here. My father owns this land. Call him. Tell him to stop this." "Mr. King is unavailable," Stone said, his voice flat. "He has authorized us to secure the site. We are also here to disconnect any unauthorized utilities." "Utilities?" Keisha asked, her voice trembling. Stone nodded to one of his men. "Proceed with the disconnect." The man walked over to the side of the house where the utility meters were located. He carried a heavy wrench. With a few swift turns, he shut off the main water valve. Then he locked it with a heavy-duty padlock. Next, he went to the electrical box. He pulled the main breaker. The hum of the refrigerator inside the house died. The furnace stopped its rhythmic chugging. The lights, if any were on, went dark. "What are you doing?" Keisha screamed, running down the steps. "Turn it back on. It is freezing." "The utilities are in the name of King Holdings, LLC," Stone explained. "The account has been closed. We are removing the meters to prevent theft of services." He wasn't lying. I had paid the bills for that house for 20 years. Every kilowatt of electricity, every drop of water had been a gift, and now the gift was revoked. Keisha stood in the snow watching as the man removed the electric meter, leaving a gaping hole in the side of the house. She looked at the fence, which was now almost complete, surrounding the entire yard, blocking the driveway. "You are trapping me," she whispered. "We are securing the assets," Stone corrected. "You have 30 minutes to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises. After that, the gate will be locked from the outside. I am not leaving." Keisha shouted, running back up the stairs. "I am not going anywhere. This is my home. My father will fix this. He will see what you are doing, and he will fire you all." She slammed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide home. She was digging in. She was going to wait me out. I sat back in my chair, thousands of miles away. She still didn't get it. She still thought this was a negotiation. She thought she could use her suffering as a bargaining chip. She thought that if she made herself miserable enough, I would feel guilty and come running. She didn't understand that I had already mourned the loss of my daughter. The woman in that house was a stranger to me, a stranger who had tried to steal my life. The day dragged on. The temperature in Chicago dropped. The forecast called for a low of 10 degrees tonight. Inside the house, the residual heat would be leaking out through the windows and the walls. The furnace was dead. The water pipes would soon freeze. I checked the report from the security team. Subject remains inside. No movement detected. Perimeter secure. By late afternoon, the house would be dark. The The sun would set at 4:30. Without electricity, there would be no lights, no TV, no internet. Just the cold and the silence. Keisha would be sitting in the living room wrapped in blankets, watching her breath fog in the air. She would be trying to call me again, but the landline was dead, the connection severed along with the power. Her cell phone, if she still had charge, would be useless without the Wi-Fi and with her service plan canceled for non-payment. She was alone, in a $1,000,000 tomb. I thought about the night she told me to leave, the night she said I was a burden. I wondered if she remembered that now. I wondered if she realized that the burden she had cast off was the only thing keeping her warm. Night fell. The security team set up floodlights around the perimeter, pointing them inward at the house. The bright white light washed over the brick facade, turning it stark and prison-like. It was psychological warfare. There would be no darkness to hide in, just the blinding glare of her own stubbornness. I poured a glass of wine. I wasn't celebrating. There was no joy in this. It was a grim necessity, like setting a bone. It hurts, but it has to be done. I imagined Keisha moving through the dark house, bumping into furniture she couldn't see, shivering uncontrollably. She would go to the kitchen to get a glass of water, but the tap would be dry. She would try to flush the toilet, but the tank would be empty. The reality of her situation would be settling in. The luxury, the comfort, the entitlement, it was all gone. Stripped away layer by layer until there was nothing left but the cold, hard truth. She was not a princess. She was not special. She was just a person in a cold house with no resources and no friends. Brad was in jail. Tiffany had betrayed them. Her friends, the ones she tried so hard to impress, would not come to rescue her from a house surrounded by security guards and razor wire. They would drive by, look at the spectacle, and whisper. They would distance themselves from the scandal. She was truly, completely alone. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Stone. Subject is at the window, appears to be signaling. I looked at the photo he attached. It was grainy, taken with a night vision lens. Keisha was standing at the living room window holding a candle. She was pressing a piece of paper against the glass. I zoomed in. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled in marker. Dad, I am cold. Please. I stared at the image. The plea, the desperation. It tugged at the old instincts, the father who wanted to fix everything. But then I remembered the other piece of paper, the affidavit, the signature that would have sent me to a place far colder than this house, a place where I would have died alone and forgotten. I remembered her laughter as she toasted to my departure. I remembered her silence when Brad mocked me. She wasn't cold because of the weather. She was cold because she had no warmth of her own. She had lived off my fire for so long she had forgotten how to make a spark. I typed a reply to Stone. Maintain position. Do not engage. If she wants to leave, open the gate. Otherwise, hold the line. I put the phone down. I am cold too, daughter, I whispered to the empty room. I have been cold for a long time. I went to bed. I slept with the windows open, listening to the sound of the ocean. I was warm. I was safe. And for the first time in my life, I was putting myself first. Keisha would survive the night. It wouldn't kill her, but it would change her. The cold would seep into her bones, and it would freeze out the entitlement. It would freeze out the arrogance. And maybe, just maybe, it would leave room for something real to grow in its place. But that was up to her. I had given her the house. I had given her the lesson. Now she had to decide if she wanted to be a victim or a survivor. The siege continued, and the longest night of her life was just beginning. The darkness of the night was not enough to hide the desperation clinging to Brad like a second skin. It had been weeks since he had a warm bed or a decent meal, weeks since his world had collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance. He stood across the street from the house that used to be his kingdom, shivering in a thin jacket that offered no protection against the biting wind. His eyes, bloodshot and hollow, were fixed on the familiar silhouette of the two-story home. The windows were dark, save for a faint amber glow from the porch light mocking him with the promise of warmth and comfort he had foolishly thrown away. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a sharp physical pain that fueled the fire of his resentment. He watched the house not with nostalgia, but with a burning sense of entitlement. That was his life inside those walls. That was his living room, his kitchen, his bedroom, and now Reginald was in there. The man Brad had dismissed as weak, the man he had laughed at, was sleeping in his bed, living his life, while Brad was out here rotting in the cold. The injustice of it twisted in his gut. In Brad's warped mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the victim of a stolen life. He touched his pocket, feeling the emptiness where his wallet used to be. He had nothing left. No cards, no cash, no friends. His so-called allies had vanished the moment the money ran out. But he remembered the jewelry. Keisha had a small collection of gold and diamonds pieces he had bought her over the years, and some family heirlooms she kept in a velvet box in the master bedroom closet. In his mind, those things belonged to him. He had paid for them, or at least his presence had allowed her to keep them. Selling just a few pieces would give him enough cash to leave town to start over, to get away from this humiliating existence. He checked the street. It was empty. The neighborhood was asleep, safe in their suburban bubbles. They had no idea a predator was lurking in the shadows. Brad moved his steps, heavy but quiet. He crossed the lawn he used to mow the grass, now perfectly manicured by someone else. He circled around to the back of the house, to the sliding glass door that led into the kitchen. He remembered the old alarm system. It was ancient, faulty. If you hit the glass just right near the frame, it wouldn't trigger the sensors. He had bragged about never fixing it, calling it a waste of money. Now that laziness was his key. He found a heavy landscaping stone near the garden bed. His heart hammered against his ribs, a mix of adrenaline and fear. This was it, the point of no return. He wasn't just a bad husband or a failed father anymore. He was crossing the line into criminal. But his pride wouldn't let him stop. He convinced himself he was just taking back what was owed to him. With a grunt of effort, he swung the stone. The sound of shattering glass seemed deafening in the silence of the night, a violent crash that made him flinch. He froze, pressing his back against the exterior wall, waiting for a siren, a shout, a barking dog. Nothing. The night remained silent. The old alarm hadn't gone off. A twisted smile crept onto his face. He was right. They hadn't changed a thing. They were careless. He felt a surge of superiority. Reginald wasn't smart. He was just lucky. Brad reached through the jagged hole, undid the latch, and slid the door open. He stepped into the kitchen. The air inside was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and lemon, a scent that hit him with a wave of painful memories. He pushed them away. He didn't have time for feelings. He moved quickly through the shadows, avoiding the furniture he knew by heart. He headed straight for the stairs, his muddy boots leaving tracks on the pristine floor. He reached the master bedroom. The door was ajar. He pushed it open, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The bed was made perfectly smooth, empty. A flicker of confusion crossed his mind. Where were they? He didn't care. It made things easier. He went straight to the walk-in closet. He fumbled in the dark, his hands shaking as he swept aside clothes until his fingers brushed against the cool velvet of the jewelry box. "Got you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He grabbed the box, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline. This was his ticket out. This was his victory. He turned to leave, ready to disappear into the night, but as he stepped out of the closet, the room was suddenly flooded with blinding light. Brad gasped, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes. He dropped the jewelry box, the contents spilling across the floor with a clatter of gold and gemstones. Through the glare, he saw figures standing in the doorway. Not Reginald, not Keisha. Police. "Freeze. Put your hands in the air. Now." The command was shouted with authority, leaving no room for hesitation. Brad stood paralyzed, blinking rapidly. 3 officers had their weapons drawn, trained squarely on his chest. Behind them, calmly leaning against the doorframe of the hallway, stood Reginald. Reginald wasn't wearing pajamas. He was dressed in casual clothes, arms crossed his face, an unreadable mask of calm. He looked at Brad not with anger, but with a profound, pitying disappointment. Brad's mind raced, trying to process the trap he had walked into. The alarm hadn't gone off. It had been silent. "You didn't think I would leave the old system in, did you?" "Brad," Reginald said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. Brad stared at him, his mouth hanging open. "I upgraded everything the day you left." Reginald continued, stepping into the room as the officers moved in to cuff Brad. Silent sensors on every window, motion detectors in the hallway, and a direct link to the station. They were on their way before your boot even touched the kitchen floor. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around Brad's wrists, biting into his skin. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He wasn't leaving with the gold. He wasn't leaving with his dignity. He was leaving in chains. "You set me up!" Brad screamed, struggling as the officers pushed him toward the door. "You knew I would come. You trapped me." "I didn't trap you." Reginald replied, walking alongside the officers, maintaining that infuriating calmness. "You trapped yourself the moment you decided you were entitled to things that aren't yours." As they dragged him down the stairs past the broken glass in the kitchen, Brad saw the full extent of his failure. The house wasn't asleep. It was a fortress, and he had walked right into the dungeon. But the true humiliation was waiting outside. Reginald had not only installed a silent alarm, he had contacts. As the police led Brad out the front door, the flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers illuminated the street. Neighbors were standing on their porches, wrapped in robes, watching the spectacle. And right there at the edge of the driveway was a local news van. A cameraman had his lens focused right on Brad's face. Brad tried to duck his head to hide, but the officer held him firm. "Look at him," a neighbor whispered loud enough to be heard. "That's Keisha's ex. I heard he broke in." "Disgusting," another voice replied. "Stealing from his own family." Brad's rage boiled over. He couldn't handle the shame, the judgment, the utter defeat. He started screaming, his face contorted and ugly in the harsh camera light. "This is my house. That man is a thief. He stole my life. Tell them, Reginald. Tell them you stole my life." Reginald stood on the porch, elevated above the chaos. He didn't shout back. He didn't argue. He simply watched as the man who had once terrorized this home was shoved into the back of a police car like common trash. The officer slammed the door, muttering to his partner. "Burglary, breaking and entering in violation of a restraining order. He's going away for a long time." Inside the car, Brad pressed his face against the glass. He saw Keisha step out onto the porch next to Reginald. She looked tired, sad, but safe. Reginald put a protective arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. They didn't look at Brad with fear anymore. They looked at him like he was a ghost, a bad memory that was finally being exorcised. The news reporter was already speaking into her microphone, the camera panning from the broken window to the police car. Brad could imagine the headline: "The desperate ex-husband, the failed thief, the man who had everything and lost it all because he couldn't conquer his own ego." As the car pulled away, driving him toward a cold cell and a future of gray walls, Brad realized that his revenge hadn't hurt Reginald at all. It had only completed his own destruction. He had come to shatter their window, but he had only succeeded in shattering the last remnants of his own life. The silence returned to the street, but this time it wasn't the silence of a sleeping neighborhood. It was the silence of peace finally being restored now that the threat was gone for good. The elevator ride up to the 45th floor felt like an ascension to a judgment she wasn't ready to face. Keisha stood in the corner of the polished metal box, clutching her worn handbag as if it contained the last fragments of her dignity. Her reflection in the steel doors stared back at her, a pale, gaunt woman who barely resembled the arrogant daughter who had once walked through these same streets as if she owned them. The city below was a sprawling grid of gray and steel, indifferent to her collapse. She had spent the last 3 nights sleeping on a mattress on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the echo of an empty house she could no longer afford to heat. The bank notices the foreclosure warnings, the final demands they had piled up like snowdrifts against the door until there was no way out but this. She stepped into the reception area of the law firm, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of her cheap shoes. The air smelled of expensive leather and intimidating silence. When she asked for Mr. Sterling, her voice cracked, betraying the desperation she was trying so hard to hide behind a mask of composure. She wasn't here to fight anymore. The fight had been drained out of her along with her bank account. She was here to beg, though she tried to tell herself it was just a negotiation. Mr. Sterling didn't keep her waiting. He was a man who valued time more than sentiment, a mirror image of the business empire her father had built. He sat behind a desk that seemed wide enough to land a plane on his fingers laced together, his expression unreadable. The chair opposite him was low, designed to make anyone sitting in it feel small, and as Keisha sat down, she felt herself shrinking. "Where is he?" Keisha asked, her eyes darting to the closed door behind the lawyer. She had expected, perhaps foolishly, that her father would be here. She had imagined a scene where she would cry, he would soften, and this nightmare would end with a hug and a check. She still believed deep down that the bond of blood was a currency she could spend endlessly. Mr. Sterling didn't look at the door. He looked at a file in front of him. "Mr. King will not be joining us," he said, his voice smooth and cold as polished glass. "He has authorized me to handle this matter in its entirety. You are not here to see your father, Keisha. You are here to discuss the liquidation of your assets and your removal from the property." The words hit her like a physical slap. He wasn't coming. He wasn't even going to look her in the eye. For the first time, the reality of her exile truly settled in. It wasn't a punishment phase. It was a permanent severance. Keisha swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to humiliate her further. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. "The bank is taking the house next week. I have debts. I have nothing." Mr. Sterling opened the file. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered numbers. "We are aware of the situation. We know that you have stripped the house of its value. We know about the second mortgage you took out and the loans you defaulted on. Technically, the house belongs to the bank now. It is a shell, a liability." He slid a document across the mahogany surface. It was thick-bound in a blue cover that looked official and final. "However," Mr. Sterling continued, "Mr. King is willing to offer you a solution, a final solution. He is prepared to purchase the property, or rather the debts associated with the property, and take it off your hands immediately. He is offering to buy out your equity." Keisha's heart leaped. A buyout. That meant money. That meant a chance to start over, to perhaps regain some footing. How much, she asked, leaning forward, her hunger for salvation visible in her eyes. Mr. Sterling paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. He adjusted his glasses and looked at her with a pity that was far worse than anger. "We have appraised the home's current condition and factored in the liens against it. Mr. King is offering you 10% of the market value." 10%. Keisha froze. 10% was an insult. It was a pittance. It wasn't a payout. It was barely enough to cover her outstanding personal debts and put a deposit on a cheap apartment in a bad neighborhood. "That's impossible," she stammered. "The house is worth millions. 10% is nothing. It's crumbs." "It is not a negotiation," Mr. Sterling said, his voice hardening. "It is a lifeline. Without this offer, you leave with nothing. The bank takes the house on Tuesday. You will be evicted with $0 to your name and a bankruptcy on your record that will follow you for 7 years. This 10% is cash. It is immediate. It is enough to clear your name with your creditors and find a modest place to live." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "But there is a condition." Keisha looked at the document, the numbers swimming before her eyes. "What condition?" "You must sign a formal agreement," Mr. Sterling said, tapping the paper with his index finger. "A permanent restraining order and a non-disclosure agreement. By accepting this money, you agree to never contact Mr. King again. You will not call him. You will not visit his properties. You will not speak to the press about him. You will effectively cease to exist in his world. If you violate this agreement, the money must be returned in full and legal action will be taken immediately." The room seemed to spin. This wasn't a business deal. It was a payoff to disappear. Her father was paying her to become a ghost. Keisha sat back, the breath leaving her lungs in a ragged gasp. She looked around the opulent office, realizing that this was the closest she would ever get to her father's world again. She thought about the years of arrogance, the way she had treated him, the demands she had made, the entitlement she had worn like a crown. She had thought his love was a bottomless well she could draw from without ever replenishing. She had thought she could break the rules and he would always be there to fix the pieces. She was wrong. She looked at the check Mr. Sterling had placed on top of the document. The number was small. So painfully small compared to the life she had lost. But as she stared at it, a horrifying realization washed over her. This 10% wasn't an insult. It was an accurate valuation. It was the value of her gratitude. It was the calculated worth of her relationship with him. She had given him nothing but grief, selfishness, and betrayal. And in return, she was getting exactly what she had invested. This 10% was the last drop of mercy he had left for her. It was the final act of a father who still couldn't bear to see his child on the street, even if he could no longer bear to see her face. It was the price of her ingratitude. Tears finally spilled over, hot and shameful, running down her cheeks and dripping onto her hands. She wasn't crying because the money was low. She was crying because she finally understood what she had done. She had sold her father's love for temporary comforts, and now the market had crashed. "I can't," she whispered, though she knew she had no choice. "You can, and you will," Mr. Sterling said, uncapping a heavy fountain pen and placing it next to the paper. "Or you can walk out that door and face the eviction marshals on Tuesday. It is your choice, Keisha. It has always been your choice." Keisha reached for the pen. Her hand shook so violently she had to steady it with her other hand. She felt the weight of the instrument heavy and cold. This signature would be the tombstone of her former life. It was an admission of total defeat. She looked at the clause in bold letters. The undersigned agrees to forfeit all familial claims and contact rights. She remembered the Christmas dinners she had skipped, the phone calls she had ignored unless she needed money, the way she had sneered at his advice. The memories played out like a reel of evidence against her. She was guilty. This was her sentence. She pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed black and permanent. She signed her name, the letters shaky and uneven. With each stroke, she felt a tether, snapping, a bridge burning. She signed the non-disclosure. She signed the transfer of the deed. She signed the restraining order agreement. When she finished, she dropped the pen as if it had burned her. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything that had made her who she was. Mr. Sterling took the documents and checked the signatures with efficient precision. He didn't smile. He didn't offer comfort. He simply slid the check across the desk toward her. "This concludes our business," he said, standing up. "The money will be available in your account within 24 hours. You have 48 hours to vacate the property before the locks are changed." Keisha took the check. It was a piece of paper that represented her survival, but it felt heavy as lead. She stood up, her legs weak. She wanted to ask him to tell her father she was sorry. She wanted to send a message, a plea for forgiveness. But she looked at the document she had just signed. She had sold her right to apologize. She walked to the door, her steps slow and uneven. She didn't look back at Mr. Sterling. She walked out into the reception area, past the judgmental gaze of the receptionist, and into the elevator. As the doors closed, shutting out the world of wealth and security she had squandered, Keisha leaned her head against the cold metal wall and let the sobs rack her body. She was going down to the street level, down to the reality she had tried so hard to avoid. She had the money. She could pay her debts. She could rent a room. She would survive. But as the elevator plummeted toward the ground, Keisha King realized she was poorer than she had ever been in her life. She had 10% of a house but 0% of a family, and that was a deficit she could never earn back. The doors opened to the lobby and she stepped out into the harsh gray light of the afternoon, a woman with a check in her hand and a hole in her heart where her father used to be. The city noise rushed in to meet her, indifferent and loud, swallowing her whole as she disappeared into the crowd, just another stranger with a story of what used to be. The neighborhood of Willow Creek had always been a place where silence was a currency and privacy was a religion. But for the past 2 weeks, the silence had been broken by a constant buzzing undercurrent of speculation. The subject of every hushed conversation over garden fences and every text message in the community group chat was the same: the King Mansion, the sprawling estate that sat at the end of the cul-de-sac with its manicured lawns and imposing pillars, had become a ghost ship in a sea of suburbia. Everyone knew the story, or at least the version of the story that had bled out into the public domain. They knew about the daughter Keisha and her spectacular fall from grace. They knew about the ex-husband who had been dragged away in handcuffs. They knew the house was now empty, a hollow shell stripped of its drama and its inhabitants. The question that hung heavy in the humid afternoon air was simple. What would Reginald King do next? The real estate sharks were already circling. Luxury sedans with magnetic logos on the doors had been prowling the streets, slowing down as they passed the driveway, their drivers eyeing the property with the hunger of predators sensing a wounded animal. The neighbors assumed the for sale sign would appear any day now. They expected a bidding war, a developer coming in to tear it down and build something even more ostentatious, or perhaps a young tech billionaire looking for a trophy home. They calculated the property values in their heads, worrying about construction noise and new neighbors. But the sign never came. Instead, a different kind of convoy arrived on a Tuesday morning. They were not luxury cars or sleek architect firms. They were white work vans, battered and dusty, with ladders strapped to the roofs and logos of local honest contractors on the sides. Plumbers, electricians, carpenters. They swarmed the property, but they didn't bring the chaotic noise of demolition. They brought the steady, rhythmic hum of transformation. Reginald was there every day. He arrived at dawn, stepping out of his modest car with a thermos of coffee and a roll of blueprints tucked under his arm. He didn't look like a grieving father or a man counting his losses. He looked like a man on a mission. He walked the perimeter of the property, pointing things out to the foreman, his gestures sharp and decisive. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, confused. They saw workers carrying out the crystal chandeliers that Keisha had insisted on installing, loading them into trucks to be sold or donated. They saw the gold-plated fixtures being removed, replaced with sturdy, functional steel. They saw the expensive, impractical silk carpets being rolled up and carried away, revealing the hardwood floors underneath. It wasn't a renovation for a sale. It felt like a purging. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood's self-appointed watchman, finally worked up the courage to approach the mailbox while Reginald was inspecting the front gate. She adjusted her sun hat, feigning a casual stroll. "Good afternoon, Mr. King," she chirped, her eyes darting toward the house where a crew was widening the front entrance. "It looks like quite the project. Are you getting it ready for the market? We were wondering if we should expect open houses soon." Reginald turned to her. His face, lined with the stress of the past year, softened into a small, enigmatic smile. He looked at the house not with pride of ownership, but with a sense of solemn duty. "No, Mrs. Gable," Reginald said, his voice low and steady. "It will not be going on the market. This house has taken enough from the world. It is time it started giving something back." He didn't elaborate, leaving Mrs. Gable with more questions than answers. The work continued for another month. The changes were subtle but specific. Ramps were installed alongside the marble stairs, blending seamlessly into the architecture but providing essential access. The bathrooms were gutted and refitted with safety rails and accessible showers. The massive master bedroom, which had once been Keisha's fortress of solitude, was reconfigured into a communal library and counseling space. The other bedrooms were painted in warm, calming earth tones, furnished not with designer pieces, but with comfortable, sturdy beds and desks. Then the final touches began. A large industrial-grade kitchen was installed, designed for feeding many people, not just a family of 3. A vegetable garden was dug in the backyard, replacing the ornamental rose bushes that Keisha had never watered. The purpose of the transformation remained a mystery until the day the black vans arrived. They weren't moving vans. They bore the emblem of the National Veterans Association. Reginald stood on the porch dressed in a simple suit, watching as the vehicles pulled into the long circular driveway. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a few men in military uniforms and a woman holding a clipboard. But the most important guests were the ones stepping out of the vans. They were men of different ages, different races, united by a shared look of weariness and resilience. Some walked with canes. One was in a wheelchair. They carried duffel bags and plastic sacks, possessing very little in the world. These were men who had served their country, who had given their youth and their health, and who had returned to a society that had left them behind. They were the homeless veterans of the city, men who had been sleeping in shelters or under bridges, men who had been forgotten. Reginald walked down the steps to meet them. He didn't offer them pity. He offered them his hand. He shook the hand of the first man, a gray-bearded veteran with a limp, and looked him in the eye. "Welcome home," Reginald said. The words rippled through the small crowd. Home. It was a word many of them hadn't said with conviction in years. They looked up at the house, this massive, beautiful structure that usually excluded people like them. They looked at the wide doors, the ramps, the warm lights glowing in the windows. They looked, waiting for the catch, waiting for the rules, waiting to be told to go around the back. But Reginald swept his arm toward the front door. "This is your house now," he announced, his voice carrying over the wind. "You earned it a long time ago." The neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalks finally understood. The whispers of speculation died out, replaced by a heavy, respectful silence. Reginald King hadn't sold the house for a profit. He hadn't tried to recoup the millions he had lost on his ungrateful daughter. He had donated the entire estate, the land, the building, the furnishings to the Veterans Association. He had established a permanent trust to pay for the utilities and maintenance. He had taken a monument to greed and turned it into a sanctuary for service. Inside the house was alive again, but the energy was different. It wasn't the frantic, anxious energy of Keisha trying to impress high society. It was the quiet, grateful energy of men finding a safe harbor. In the kitchen, the smell of a hearty stew began to waft through the air. In the living room, men sat in the armchairs, not arguing about status, but sharing stories of survival. Reginald walked through the halls of the house he had bought for a family that didn't exist anymore. He passed the room that had been Keisha's. He saw an older veteran sitting at the desk writing a letter, a picture of his estranged grandchildren propped up against the lamp. The man looked up and nodded at Reginald, a silent gesture of thanks that was worth more than any "I love you" Keisha had ever feigned to get a credit card. Reginald felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in decades. The toxicity of the house was gone. The memories of Brad's arrogance and Keisha's entitlement had been scrubbed from the walls, replaced by the dignity of these men. He realized that he hadn't lost the house. He had finally found its purpose. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, a truck from a signage company pulled up to the front gate. Two workers jumped out and began to install a heavy bronze plaque on the stone pillar at the entrance. Reginald walked down to the end of the driveway to watch. He stood with his hands in his pockets, the cool evening breeze ruffling his hair. He watched as they tightened the bolts and polished the surface until it gleamed in the twilight. The sign didn't say King Estate. It didn't boast of wealth or power. It read simply and boldly, "The King Veterans Home, a place of rest for those who served." It was his name. But for the first time, it wasn't a brand. It wasn't a signature on a check. It was a legacy. A neighbor, the same Mrs. Gable who had been so curious weeks ago, walked by walking her dog. She stopped and looked at the sign, then looked at Reginald. Her expression had changed. There was no judgment, no gossip. There was only a quiet, profound respect. "You did a good thing, Mr. King," she said softly. "A very good thing." Reginald nodded, his eyes fixed on the bronze letters. "I didn't do it for me," he replied, though in his heart he knew he had saved himself just as much as he had saved the men inside. He had saved his soul from becoming bitter. He had chosen to end the cycle of taking and begin a cycle of giving. He turned and looked back at the house one last time. The lights were on in every window, pushing back the darkness. He could hear faint laughter drifting from the open door. It wasn't the mocking laughter of his former son-in-law. It was the laughter of camaraderie and relief. Reginald King smiled a true, genuine smile. He turned his back on the mansion, got into his modest car, and drove away. He was leaving the property behind, but he was taking his dignity with him. The house was no longer his, and that was the greatest victory he could have ever achieved. The King Veterans Home was open for business, and the ghosts of the past had been evicted for good. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sound block, a sharp and final crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. To Brad, it sounded like the breaking of his own spine. He stood frozen in his orange jumpsuit, the fabric itching against his skin, staring blankly at the judge, who looked down at him with a mixture of severity and disgust. 8 years. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. 8 years in a state penitentiary for financial fraud, embezzlement, and most damning of all, elder abuse. The courtroom was not packed with supporters. His so-called friends, the ones who had drunk his expensive whiskey and laughed at his jokes about his father-in-law, were nowhere to be seen. Only the cold, impersonal faces of the bailiffs and the tired expression of his public defender were there to witness his end. Brad tried to summon some of his old arrogance, tried to sneer, to tell them they were making a mistake, but his throat was dry. The reality of the cage was closing in. As the bailiffs took his arms to lead him away, he looked back one last time, hoping to see someone, anyone who might care, but the benches were empty. He had burned every bridge, spent every ounce of goodwill, and now he was leaving the world of comfort and entering a world of concrete and steel. Prison was not the country club Brad had deluded himself into expecting. It was a sensory assault of clanging metal, shouting voices, and the pervasive smell of bleach and unwashed bodies. But the worst part wasn't the food or the hard cot. It was the hierarchy. In the ecosystem of the cell block, crimes had a ranking. Thieves and dealers were common. But Brad's file followed him. The other inmates, men with hard eyes and tattooed skin, knew exactly why he was there. They knew he was the man who had terrorized an old man who had tried to steal the home of a senior citizen. There is a strange, twisted code of honor even among criminals. You don't hurt women, you don't hurt children, and you don't disrespect the elderly. Many of these men had mothers and grandmothers they revered, and Brad represented everything they despised. He wasn't a tough guy. He was a coward who preyed on the weak. His first night in the general population was a lesson in terror. He sat in the corner of the recreation yard trying to make himself invisible, but a shadow fell over him. A group of inmates surrounded him. They didn't shout. They didn't make a scene. They just smiled, cold and predatory. One of them, a man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned in close. He whispered that they had read the papers. They knew about the broken window. They knew about the threats. They made sure Brad understood his place. He became the lowest of the low. His food trays would often be flipped. His sleep was interrupted by threats whispered through the bars. He was pushed in the showers, tripped in the hallways. He who had once strutted around Reginald's mansion like a king was now a servant to men he would have once crossed the street to avoid. Every day was a struggle for survival, a constant reminder of his own weakness. The arrogance was beaten out of him, replaced by a permanent flinch, a constant look of fear. Brad had wanted to be a big man, but in here he was nothing but a cautionary tale, miles away in a different kind of prison. Keisha stood behind the counter of a discount grocery store. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a buzzing sound that drilled into her skull, triggering a migraine that never seemed to fully go away. Her uniform was a polyester smock 2 sizes too big with a name tag that hung crookedly on her chest. Her hands, once manicured and adorned with diamond rings, were now dry and chapped from handling cardboard boxes and counting dirty coins. The line of customers seemed endless. They were tired people, angry people, people counting every cent just to survive. Just like her. The scanner beeped with a monotonous rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. It was the soundtrack of her new life. She scanned cans of beans, generic cereal loaves of discounted bread. She remembered the days when she wouldn't even look at price tags, when she would throw cashmere sweaters into her cart without a second thought. Now she knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. She lived in a studio apartment on the edge of town, in a building where the elevator never worked and the hallway always smelled of boiled cabbage. Her furniture was second-hand, mismatched pieces she had dragged up 3 flights of stairs herself. The 10% payout from her father's lawyer had gone mostly to paying off the crushing debt Brad had left her with, leaving her with just enough to secure this bleak existence. The hardest part of her day wasn't the physical labor, it was the customers, specifically the elderly ones. Every time an old man walked up to her register, shuffling slowly, counting out nickels and dimes with shaking hands, Keisha felt a wave of nausea. She would see their gray hair, their weathered skin, and she would see Reginald. One afternoon, an elderly gentleman in a worn coat approached her lane. He had kind eyes and a soft voice, apologizing for taking too long to find his coupons. Keisha froze. He sounded just like her father used to sound when he was trying to be patient with her tantrums. The shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She couldn't look him in the eye. She kept her head bowed, staring at the conveyor belt, muttering the total. "Have a blessed day, young lady," the man said as he took his receipt. Keisha couldn't answer. She just nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying. She wanted to scream that she wasn't blessed, that she was cursed by her own ungrateful heart. She watched him walk away, a painful reminder of the love she had thrown into the trash. She realized then that her poverty wasn't just financial. It was spiritual. She was empty. Her break time finally arrived. Keisha clocked out and walked over to the small magazine rack near the entrance of the store. It was her only escape, a few minutes to look at glossy pictures of a world she used to inhabit. She usually flipped through fashion magazines, torturing herself with images of dresses she could no longer afford. But today a different cover caught her eye. It was a business magazine, a prestigious publication that sat on the top shelf. The cover featured a vibrant, full-color photograph of a man standing on a pristine beach. The ocean behind him was a brilliant turquoise, the sky a perfect azure. But it wasn't the scenery that made Keisha's breath catch in her throat. It was the man. It was Reginald King. He looked different, younger somehow. The lines of stress that had etched his face during the last years of their relationship had smoothed out. He wasn't wearing a stiff suit. He was wearing a linen shirt, relaxed and casual, with a lei of flowers around his neck. He was tanned, healthy, and he was smiling. It wasn't the polite, guarded smile she was used to. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a smile that reached his eyes. Keisha's trembling hand reached out and took the magazine. She read the headline in bold, white letters. The Philanthropist's Second Act, How Reginald King Turned Tragedy into Triumph and Found Peace in Paradise. She opened the magazine with frantic fingers, ignoring the customers bustling past her. The article detailed his donation of the mansion to the veterans. It spoke of his new foundation dedicated to helping others. But the end of the article focused on his personal life. It mentioned that Mr. King had retired to Hawaii, where he spent his days gardening, volunteering, and enjoying the company of a new community that respected him not for his money, but for his heart. There was another photo inside. Reginald was sitting at a large outdoor table surrounded by friends, raising a glass and a toast. He looked free. He looked unburdened. Keisha stared at the photo, and the truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had thought that without her he would be lonely. She had arrogantly believed that she was the center of his world and that punishing him with her absence would break him. But she was wrong. Her absence hadn't broken him. It had healed him. By cutting her out, by removing the cancer of her ingratitude and Brad's toxicity, Reginald had finally been able to breathe. He had found a life that was richer and fuller than anything he had when she was dragging him down. Keisha looked from the glossy photo of her father in paradise to her own reflection in the store window. She saw the cheap smock, the tired eyes, the gray surroundings of the discount supermarket. She saw a woman who had been given everything and had ended up with nothing because she didn't know how to say thank you. Her father was happy, truly happy, and he was happy because he was far, far away from her. A tear dropped onto the magazine page, landing right on the blue ocean water. Keisha quickly wiped it away, terrified of damaging the only connection she had left to him. She closed the magazine and put it back on the rack, smoothing the cover with a gentle, reverent touch. She couldn't afford to buy it. It cost $7 and she needed that for bus fare and dinner. "Hey, Register 3 is open," her manager shouted from across the store. "Let's go, Keisha, break's over." Keisha flinched. She took one last look at her father's smiling face, whispering a goodbye that he would never hear. She turned her back on the image of paradise and walked back to her register, back to the beep of the scanner, back to the gray reality she had built for herself, brick by ungrateful brick. The automatic doors slid shut, sealing her in, while thousands of miles away the sun continued to shine on a man who had finally learned that sometimes letting go is the only way to survive. The trade winds of Maui did not just rustle the leaves of the palm trees. They seemed to blow through the very soul of the man standing on the shoreline. The air here tasted different than it did in the city. It tasted of salt and hibiscus, of freedom, and a peace so profound it felt almost tangible. Reginald King stood barefoot in the sand, the grains warm between his toes, watching the sun begin its slow, majestic descent toward the horizon. The sky was painting itself in hues of violet, burnt orange, and a gold so brilliant it made his eyes ache in the most beautiful way. He adjusted the collar of his linen shirt, a simple white garment that breathed with the wind, a stark contrast to the stifling armored suits he had worn for 40 years. He looked at his reflection in the calm water of the tide pool. The man staring back was familiar, yet entirely new. The deep furrows of stress that had once carved a map of anxiety across his forehead had smoothed out. The gray in his beard seemed distinguished, now not weary. His shoulders, once hunched under the invisible weight of a daughter's demands and a son-in-law's arrogance, were squared and strong. People had been telling him for weeks that he looked 10 years younger, but Reginald knew the truth. He didn't just look younger. He felt lighter. He felt as if he had finally exhaled after holding his breath for a lifetime. Behind him, the soft strumming of a ukulele blended with the laughter of his friends. It was a small gathering, intimate and genuine. There were no business associates trying to close a deal, no social climbers looking for a photo opportunity, and certainly no family members waiting for a handout. These were people who knew him as Reg, the man who volunteered at the community garden and told terrible jokes at the local coffee shop. And then there was Elena. She stood near the floral archway chatting with the officiant, her laughter sounding like wind chimes. She wore a simple dress the color of sea glass, a flower tucked behind her ear. She didn't care about his bank account. She didn't care about the empire he had built or the mansion he had given away. She loved the man who listened to her stories, the man who walked with her on the beach at dawn. Today, under the canopy of this golden sunset, they had exchanged vows. It wasn't the society wedding of the decade. It was a promise between two souls who had lived enough life to know what truly mattered. Reginald turned back to the ocean, a small rectangular piece of cardstock in his hand. It was the last piece of business he had to attend to, the final thread that needed to be cut before he could fully step into this new chapter. He had bought the postcard at a small tourist shop in town. On the front, it showed a generic, idyllic image of the Hawaiian coast, the kind of picture that promised paradise. He had sat at his desk for an hour, staring at the blank space on the back, his pen hovering. He had thought about writing a lecture. He had thought about listing all the ways she had hurt him, all the nights he had stayed awake worrying about her future while she was busy spending his money. But as he sat there, surrounded by the silence of his modest, happy home, he realized he didn't have any anger left. The anger had evaporated, replaced by a clarity that was as sharp and bright as the island sun. He didn't hate Keisha. He pitied her, and in a strange, twisted way, he was grateful to her. He looked down at the ink now dry on the paper. He hadn't included a return address. He hadn't put his phone number. He simply wrote the truth, the final lesson he had to teach her. Thank you for chasing me away. Because of that, I found the life I deserve. Be independent, daughter. It was brutal in its simplicity. He wasn't thanking her for her love, because there had been none. He was thanking her for her cruelty. Her greed had been the catalyst. If she hadn't pushed him to the edge, if she and Brad hadn't tried to break him, he would have stayed in that cold mansion until he died, convinced that his purpose was merely to be their provider. Her betrayal had forced him to run, and in running he had found himself. He walked over to the small mailbox at the edge of the path, the one used for outgoing mail. He dropped the postcard inside. The metal flap clanged shut, a sound of finality. It was done. She would receive it in her gray, cramped apartment. She would look at the picture of paradise. She would read the words, and she would realize that the well was truly, finally dry. He hoped for her sake that it would force her to dig her own well. But that was no longer his responsibility. Reginald turned back to the beach, but he stopped at a small trash bin near the shoreline. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old phone. It was the device that had tethered him to his old life. It was the number Keisha had memorized, the number she called only when a credit card was declined or a bill was due. It was a black mirror of obligation. He hadn't turned it on in months, but he had kept it just in case. A vestige of the old guilt, a safety net for a daughter who didn't deserve one. He looked at the black screen. He could almost hear the phantom ringtone, the shrill demand for attention. He remembered the panic in Ryan's voice, the entitlement in Keisha's texts. He weighed the device in his hand. It felt heavy, dense with bad memories. Reginald walked to the water's edge. The waves lapped at his ankles, cool and cleansing. He looked at Elena, who was watching him from the distance with a knowing smile. She didn't ask what he was doing. She knew. She nodded a silent permission to let go. He wound his arm back and threw the phone. It arced high into the air, a dark speck against the burning orange sky. It spun end over end, catching the last light of the sun before splashing into the deep water 50 yards out. It sank immediately, down into the dark, cold depths of the Pacific. Gone. The screen was black forever. The connection was severed. Reginald stood there for a moment listening. He expected to feel a pang of regret, a twinge of parental anxiety. But there was nothing. Only the sound of the waves, the wind in the palms, and the beating of his own heart, steady and strong. He turned around and walked back toward the light of the torches, toward the woman who loved him, toward the friends who respected him. He walked away from the water, leaving the debris of his past at the bottom of the ocean. As he took Elena's hand and the music swelled, he realized the greatest truth of his life. We often mistake endurance for love, believing that if we carry our children's burdens long enough, they will learn to walk. But sometimes we are merely teaching them to ride on our backs. My departure was not an act of cruelty. It was the breaking of a cycle. By removing the safety net, I forced them to face the gravity they had ignored. A parent's final duty is not just to provide, but to teach, even if the lesson is survival. Respect is the currency of family. When it runs out, the bank must close. I didn't lose a daughter. I reclaimed myself. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, extinguishing the day, but in the darkness that followed, the stars began to come out one by one, brighter than they had ever been before. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the value of self-respect, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about life justice and the strength of the human spirit. What would you have done in Reginald's place? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that it is never too late to find your own sunset.